There we go. So, so we get the Agors, and they're living on the cremation grounds. And there's a sort of sense I get with a lot of these Bharani placements, they're basically living on the cremation grounds as well. There's a lot of sort of this cycle of life, the sex and death coming involved, a lot of this sort of underground, well, underground anything, right? Underground music, underground cults, but this sort of underground stuff. It's a very, he's like, well, I had the impression before when I dove into it, when I came back to kind of editing Bharani again, it's such a strange nakshatra. It's ruled, well, it's in Aries, but it's ruled by Venus. But actually Saturn, it seems more Saturnius than anything. And it's all this sex and death stuff that you expect from Scorpio. Of course, there's a bit of Mars, Venus, right? There's that mix in it. And so it's a little bit different kind of Scorpio in a way. I just want to see if someone's needs to get into the class or they're lost or something. Okay. So there's this, it seems very strange. And then it's a second nakshatra. And geez, it seems to have so many things in common with the second sign Taurus. When I get studying, I get so confused actually, like what part of the zodiac I'm even studying when I'm looking at it, because it almost doesn't seem like Aries. Now, Aries is this very penetrating energy and it's very fiery, and so it has a lot of that. And it has to do with sort of like, when we think of the underground, it has to do with almost this entrance to the cave. And so you're either just stepping into the cave or you're just sort of stepping out of the cave. I think it sort of deals with, again, these big themes of life and death, right? Sex and death. So these big sort of cycles. And there's like, when you look at it, it's like Shivananda has Bharani placements, Ramana Maharishi has Bharani placements, Yukteswara has Bharani placements, a lot of really big gurus. Like it's very, on one hand, a lot of scientists have it, so it's very scientific, but it's very sort of deep in its thought. And a lot of these big gurus actually, they were scientists first, like they were a doctor, a couple of them were doctors first. There's a lot of doctors, a lot of scientists. We talk about the twins in Ashwini. I think I almost see more twins with Bharani placements than I see with Ashwini placements. So you see a lot of this twinning energy is still sort of going on in Bharani and in Aries. And I think the thing about Aries is, we know Aries is like it's very individualistic, right? It's like, boom, here I am, ec homo, right? Behold man, sort of an idea. And Aries people, they're very sort of selfish, and we know these sort of common things. But that's because of the division. That's because of the duality, because there's an I coming into existence through these early nakshatras. And that I is sort of distinguishing itself more and more. And so I think in Ashwini, you're more likely to get sort of identical twins, whereas in the Bharani, you're more likely to get like a boy and a girl. There's a very like, well, there's some very dirty stories about the brother-sister relationship in Bharani and with Yamanaj. Yamanaj, we know him as a god of death, but actually they call him the Dharmaraj. And so he's the one that gives us our dharma, and a lot of that's coming through karma, and it's a lot of it coming through like genetics, has a lot to do with Bharani. Again, is why it gets very confusing with Taurus, because Taurus is often known as having a lot to do with genetics. But I think Venus is very much ruling, and because Venus is that double, and he's the one that knows how to harmonize and balance, say, that double helix in the DNA structure. And so you get a lot of like people I'm looking at with Bharani placements, like evolutionary biologists, people that are dealing with the dead, so any kind of sort of historians in a way. There's a plastic surgeon, and I've got a few of these plastic surgeons and heart surgeons in my list, and none of them had birth times, and so I'm struggling to rectify them. But that's part of the nakshatra project, is actually I don't need to know what house it's in. It's in the nakshatra, so it tells me a lot actually. And part of my theory of the nakshatras is actually that I think at the end of the day and at the end of this research, and I'm nowhere near the end of this research, I don't think we need to know what house these planets are in. I think we can pretty much predict everything from the placement in the nakshatra, because it's such a fine placement by degrees, right? You get into the padas that I'm trying to list as well, and that's really hard to sort out the padas, because once you think you got it, I throw some new names in there, and I'm like, oh, those people are the same as those people, though, and then it's like, oh. So anyways, that's the nature of research. So it's a lot of hypothesis and dead ends, but a lot of really glowing, beautiful moments. Yeah, go ahead.
I think, and this is just reflection that just hits me now, where I think I agree with you strongly with the fact that the houses aren't necessarily too important because the planets are where they are. The only thing that really what will make a difference with the houses is it shows which planets are directly exposed to us and which ones are going through the Earth. So I think the houses might show if someone's more introverted or extroverted kind of thing, depending on how the energy is coming through. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
Well, it does. Well, knowing where they are in the houses is going to tell us a lot of things. Like the Vimshatari Dasha, you need to know where they are in the houses to do the Vimshatari Dasha to make the really sharp predictions about timing, say. There's some, and this is like, geez, I might not even get to this part of the research for another 5-6 years if if I'm still alive when I get to it. But there's some hints as well about timing when you're doing the nakshatra research, and you'll see it's like you'll get rich at this age or you'll lose a parent at this age, and they sort of give these sort of hints like this as well. And so I think ultimately you will be able to sort of sort some things out with the timing through that. I know one astrologer, now when I met him, his English is horrible and my Hindi's just not good enough for deep astrology conversations, but he would look at the chart and he didn't look at the Vimshatari at all. And he asks their full name. So he's matching the chart with their name and their age somehow. And he was making full predictions about the timing of events in their life, and just doing it very quickly, all in his sort of, right, just the charts there, and he gave him the name, and wow, I was like, wow, what are you doing, man? I gotta learn Hindi. So you get this sort of things coming out. So anyways, Bharani, wow, Bharani, there's a story about Yama and Yama and his sister Yami. And this is very sort of, I find it very potent, and it's a very powerful story. And so as they were growing up, the sister, geez, I haven't read the story in a while. I should have studied the notes before I came here to do this. But anyway, so you get the story. Yami is the sister, and so they're brother and sister. And Yami's the sister starts to tempt the brother, like, come on, brother, let's have sex. Let's do it. Let's try this. Let's kind of go deep underground. And Yama eventually, he refused, and he said, no, you're my sister, sort of thing. Now, that also gets confused with other stories where the two of them did have sex. And of course, this is considered sort of the deepest taboo. And well, the reason it's taboo to have sex with your sister isn't just a human law, you can say, and this is why a lot of this Saturnian stuff, it's kind of this divine law that if you have sexual relations with someone, a relative, that your children are very likely going to have Down syndrome or something like this, right? And you see that actually, you see that in a lot of these very isolated tribals these days, actually. You see a lot of, it's not that the people necessarily have Down syndrome, but you see a lot of those sort of traits in them, the sort of rounder faces and the happy sort of smile, and they're simple, sort of very, very simple people in the mind, right? And so you see that sort of how that works in these small tribals, and that might even relate to why some of these even bigger empires did collapse, is maybe it was just too much inbreeding sort of thing, and the ruling class is trying to keep that. And there is this tendency, they want to sort of that pure blood, right? Purebred, pure bloodedness. And they still try to practice this, but again, the danger of that is this sort of curse. When you try to keep it too stringent, when you don't let in anything else, then it kind of breaks down. And you see that happening with a lot of Bharanis. They're trying to hold on to things too much, right? And Bharani also, like, when we think of Yamraj, when we think of Saturn, when we think of a lot of these gods of death, they're carrying the noose, right? They're carrying the hangman's noose. And this is this binding. And in a way, this is, if we think of how nothing comes something, and it comes down through all these tappas, and then at boom, it comes down to the earth and becomes something. Then Rani is that noose, it's that karma, it's that action reaction to everything. There's that kind of little bit of rebound energy, you could say, in Bharani that way. And so it's just sort of, there's a consequence. There's so it's like Ashwini is very free. Nothing, well, Ashwini just does whatever it does. And it's almost, Ashwini's almost get away with it in a way. There's almost kind of no consequences. There's kind of headless and going off, and nothing really of major consequence, you could say. But the Bharanis are working much more with sort of this life and death. Now, Bharani gets a lot more credit for, well, bearing children, bearing loads on the back, like Atlas bearing the weight of the world up there, sort of thing. And so it gets a lot of this sort, so they talk about it even for childbirth, but I actually see just as many people working with childbirth with Ashwini Nakshatras as I do with Bharani. Now, I'm not sure just what the difference is. I'd expect the Bharanis to be a little bit more bloody and gross, but you do see a lot more sort of occultism in the Bharani, in a sense. Ashwinis can be sort of mystics and odd and things like this, but you see more of, maybe it's that scientific sort of like we're studying the Vedic sciences, we're studying the occult sciences. It's not just mysticism, you could say. It's a little bit more to it in Bharani. And so then you get a lot of these big gurus, right? They're doctors, but they're mystics. They're scientists, but they're mystics. You get a little bit of some of it. People here, well, let me bring this up. Let's start looking at some of these people, because I started to get a sense of almost like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing going on, or like a Frankenstein sort of a sense to some of the placements, nerve regeneration therapists and sort of things like this. Here, I gotta sort it out. So let me come up to the beginning of Bharani here again. You can see the Bharani page online now? Yeah, okay.
I don't think I received any of the nakshatra stuff yet, Mike, including the video. Just FYI, no rush.
Okay, I sent out, you should have received the Ashwini stuff yesterday. I sent that out, the video and the attachment. I'm sending these attachments out after I do the talk, because I'm basically editing right up to the point. And so I'm adding a lot actually in just these last sort of few days. And so you can kind of see and study online, and then you'll sort of get this. If that's okay, if that works for you. I can send them all out as well. Anyways, we'll deal with that. So sorry, something's just, there we go, someone else just showed up. So Bharani Ascendant, and so you can see I still have some blank spaces, and I don't know when that'll get corrected, but so this is the toughest one, because if we're thinking that, because this is a big research project, and I've mentioned how some birth times can still be out and things aren't correct yet, and I've still put some of these names in there because this is a lot of how I'll sort it out, is I'll look and I'll say, oh, this guy doesn't belong with any of these people. But they talk a lot about banking in Bharani. And you do see quite a few bankers, like the Rothschilds. A lot of Rothschilds have a lot of Bharani placements. Someone like Marcon in French politics, French politician, he was mostly like a banker. a big business banker. That way. You see some, I put her picture in, I put it down further. But you get the sense with a lot of these Bharanis, they have these sort of, they might have fairly like clear complexion, you can say, and a lot of light might shines from them. But it's almost like they're burnt at the edges, right? They might have these dark eyebrows and kind of this kind of darkness at the edges, almost like they sat too close to the fire in a way. Most Bharani people, there's something, they might not be necessarily beautiful on a contemporary level, but there's usually something very sort of sexy about Bharani natives. And again, it might be like for someone like Rothschild, it might just be in the way that money is sexy, right? It might be in the way that like that nice Ferrari is sexy, sort of thing. And there's always this darkness, like there's always like, especially we know with the Rothschilds, there's a lot of underground money. There's a lot of things hidden. There's sort of this, well, Shakespeare's a tough one because I'm not even sure if there was a very accurate birth day for Shakespeare, but anyways, I've got him with some Bharani placements, and there's almost is this sort of theatrical aspect to Bharani, right? This theatrical aspect to the sexiness of Bharani, right? Like the way a Ferrari is sexy, but there's also this, you know, when I think of Shakespeare and I think of this kind of theater acting, there's that image of the two masks, right? The happy and the sad mask. And I find that a very potent image for Bharani. It's sort of those two faces. It's that theatricalness. And so no matter how sort of much darkness they sort of have inside, they're smiling and pleasant on the outside to a certain degree. Like this. And so I found it quite interesting, especially like we talk about the burnt edges and that darkness. Sun is always the light that we shine. And so I didn't put it, I thought I had more. All right. I got pictures in here somewhere of these people, but we come down to the sun, and some of these are a little bit controversial, like Saddam Hussein's chart, for example. I've changed his birth date by like, I think 2 days, because he was born in some village squalor, and his birth date, as far as I was concerned, was completely inaccurate, and I didn't agree with any of them. So, but you can see how he's very much like Ulysses S. Grant, war of attrition. He really wiped out like thousands of people in a very harsh way. But they lived in this sort of luxury in a way. They became almost these theatrical characters of what war is, in a sense. There's Shakespeare's name with his son in Bharani. I found there's a lot of sort of gatekeeping with this. And in a way, that's what a banker is, or you can say in a sense, so this gatekeeper. Some of these politicians were gatekeepers. You think of in the war, like Ulysses, how he ended up winning the war was this war of attrition, actually. And so he starved out the other side, basically. And so he closed all the gates, quite literally. And so you sort of see this sort of thing. Saddam Hussein was also known as that sort of thing. Very sort of dark sort of people. Someone like Dale Earnhardt, I don't know if you know who he was. He was a NASCAR driver, a race car driver. And again, I'm not sure how he was so much a gatekeeper, but he was also this sort of, we see the spiritual element in a lot of these people somewhere in the background, like even Saddam Hussein had his spiritual preferences. And Dale Earnhardt too was a very strong Catholic. And he, if I recall correct, and this might be true of a lot of these Bharanis, I know one of the Koch brothers was he a son? I know the Koch brothers had some Bharani placements, and he survived sort of this, it was a plane crash on the runway. I think he was taking off and a plane landed on the wrong runway or something. Anyway, a bunch of people were killed on the plane. He survived. After that, he became very philanthropic. Started giving a lot of money away. And you find this in a lot of these people, these very close, near-death experiences, certainly with the warriors, of course. But someone like Dale Earnhardt also had some very bad car accidents. Curtis Joseph was a goaltender. There's quite a few hockey goaltenders had Bharani placements as well, I noticed, right? Sort of blocking the net in a sense. And if we look at the philosophers, a lot of these philosophers were dealing with political philosophy or economics. Soren Kierkegaard was a little bit deeper than that. And he's good for any sort of Kashmiri Shivas to study, actually, and read his works. Very sort of tantric in his worldviews. We see someone like Sigmund Freud, and I would have to look at the birth times again. I think I changed his chart. Carl Jung, Swami Laxman Jew. Actually, I just stumbled across it. Didn't even occur to me for the longest time to even look for Laxman Jews. I didn't imagine they would have it. And then I stumbled across it. I was like, wow. He's sort of the Adi guru of Kashmiri Shaivism in the modern times, I guess you could say. Yeah, go ahead.
This might be a little off topic. I'm just curious. So you separate them in padas, right? Is that what that is? And I'm not sure what padas are.
Yeah, the little 4 is a separation into the padas. So each nakshatra is like, was it 12.3 or 13.2? I can't remember right offhand. Degrees. And so each pada, then they break each nakshatra into 4 parts. And so each pada is 3.2 degrees. So it's a very very fine sort of tuning. And so you can see with Sun, I've got a little bit written here. I found some stuff in the classics written here. Some of it seems to be fairly accurate, and some of it's quite out to lunch, actually. And so some of those classic sort of shlokas on the padas, I'm like, oh, I don't know. Anyway, so I'm not getting it from first source either. I'm taking from a second source, so maybe that's even the problem. I'm not doing my research good enough. So, but yeah, and patterns is one of the things, like, it's really hard to find anything about that, about the other planets. Like, so that's kind of, anyways, I'm trying to fill in those little blanks. Someone showed me a book. I can't remember the name of it. It was actually a Western astrology book, but it was talking about the positions of each of the planets within like 3 degrees. And so it was basically talking about the planets within. And I looked at a couple of them, right? Just sort of looked at my own or looked what I knew. And it was fairly close. And so there is stuff out there in the Western astrology in different places can be found. So these fine placements, it's there, but it needs to be sort of looked at. And then what I'm trying to do, compare it with names of people that actually have it, and just to see. Oh, there you are. Go ahead, Sharmita.
Shantosh ji, namaskar. I'm sorry I am late today.
Yeah, no problem.
My short question is that I am a newbie in this astrology, in Vedic astrology. So when I am studying at home, as per my understanding, what I am doing is that I am trying to understand whatever each of the house represent. And suppose if Bharani is located in a particular house number 5, then that house, if it is related to some kind of thing, occupation or something, loosely I'm telling, I'm still not very thorough which house represent what, then that, you mean to say that qualities will be seen in that house, in that aspect of the person's life? If I'm wrong, please correct me, Pranav.
Okay, so let's look at an example here. I didn't do the research on these people, I don't think. Oh, I did something about her. Penelope Cruz. I got to put her name with the picture so I know who that is. So, and you saw a lot of this, like studying dance, studying theater, right? Doing auditions, like so many, a lot of actors have this. So anyways, but to go to your question then, so here she has Sun in Bharani, and in the first house, and here Sun is ruling the 5th house. So this is actually very good for theater because Sun is the 5th lord, which is also very theatrical. And then it's coming into the Ascendant. And so it's really bringing that theater into who she is. And I've probably seen Penelope Cruz films, but I can't think of one offhand. You can see she looks very Bharani, right? When I said like sat too close to the fire, got burnt on the edges a little bit. Sort of a singed look, but anyways, so what's happening here is her theater then and the movies that she's done, a lot of them are probably going to relate with the Bharani, those fifth house things. But for her, they're very personal, actually. Her movies are probably very much tied with who she is. And that's kind of actually, a lot of Hollywood is kind of it's considered a fairly modern theater technique, is to go out there and play characters that are basically who you are. Before, actors used to have to act, right? And so she studied theater and she studied things like that. But that might have been actually the theater technique. And so they become the character sort of idea. And so that's, I think, very Bharani sort of thing. It's that sort of, again, that Jekyll and Hyde, where you take on these different faces and masks and you're able to play these sort of different roles. So for her, her theater, her fifth house stuff, even her children might be very Bharani, which we might have to see some other placements. Sun might not be a great position for those Bharani children, just have Sun as fifth lord in Bharani. But so we can look down and let's go to another one here, because I probably have more interesting people that I know something about than her. Well, I don't know what some of that is. I'm very confused even about what I wrote on that. So I'm going to go find somebody else. So let's look at Tagore. Well, let's look at this. So we got Tagore, we have Willie Nelson, Calamity Jane. Tagore is interesting. He's almost, as far as well, he's almost a Willie Nelson figure in Hindu poetry, in a sense. Wrote this very simple things that appealed to everyone, like Willie Nelson in a way. And so you get someone like Calamity Jane. And so here we're getting the fifth lord in the night. Again, it's very celebrity. It's very high philosophy. In this case, I'm not so sure actually if this is Willie Nelson's chart, if his birth time is correct, because I'd certainly expect this more from a Tagore, like a celebrated philosopher, and celebrated in their death, before and after death, celebrated for the work they've done. But there's a few names. It's a bad example because there's so many names here. I can see Carla Homolka and Calamity Jane going together. Even Alina has a little bit. These are kind of, Carla Homolka killed a bunch of people. She was a mass murderer. Calamity Jane was a Willie Nelson figure, actually. I think she did kill a bunch of people, but then she started to do sort of stage theater about killing a bunch of people. She was in, who's that other big cowboy guy, started to stage these sort of cowboy stuff. Anyways, I can't remember the names. Here we get these, okay, more surgeons, midwives. Here's a nice example. I think a lot of these people go together. David Carpenter was another killer. So many killers, mass murderer. People have Bharani placements. It's like, wow. It's dark. It's a dark place. And so, well, this is his reputation, you could say, the 10th Lord going in sixth house. And so they're becoming known for these sort of, could be crimes, and David Carpenter's kind of dark stuff. Even Leonardo da Vinci did a lot of, he got to know anatomy by doing dissections and things like this. And then you get this, well, I put incarcerated midwife, but she was actually in Auschwitz, midwife in Auschwitz. Stanislaus, and I'm not going to try that too much. And then someone like Ulysses S. Grant, of course, he was a major figure in war. Now, Ulysses S. Grant, I have to admit, I also doctored his birth time. And a lot of people have actually followed the chart with his birth time, but again, I didn't agree with, same with Saddam Hussein's charts that you see online. I didn't agree with their assessments. And so you get this, like, this is kind of the 10th Lord in the sixth house. Well, the 10th Lord is their career. And so that the sign in the 10th house has a little bit more to do with the atmosphere in which they're working, you could say, but then that becomes this Aries sort of atmosphere. And then the Lord of that 10th, though, is going into the 6th. And so that has a lot to do as well with where they're going to work, where the battlefield is, 6th house as well, where that therapy needs to be done. And of course, it's very certain and very the authority on, you could say in a loose way, the authority of solving problems, but they're doing it in this very life and death way. No, I think it was Sun in the 10th house. Yeah, here. We get again, we see Ulysses on the, and we see actually in Ulysses, it's the 10th Lord in the 6th house, but also the 2nd Lord in the 10th house. And so those 10th house things really apply to him. He was I don't know if you know who he was, maybe some of you don't know him. He was a general in the American Civil War, the guy who won the war. And that's some of the controversy, because mostly they agree with the side that won. But actually, when they look at the generals from the two sides, this guy was brutal. This guy was just like, he was like a Saddam Hussein, you could say, in a lot of ways, really, really brutal in his tactics. And the side that lost, that was fighting General Lee, you could say, was like a statesman, a general and a statesman, and you're considered like really as a man, a really great man, you could say, where this Ulysses Grant was just sort of a dirtbag. And so you're seeing this, like, a lot of these people, especially with the sun there, they stand in the doorway of life and death. And a lot of them are sort of like, they're making the decision who lives and who dies. And we see that in surgeons as well. They're making that decision, who lives, who dies. This midwife working in Auschwitz, God, I'm sure her whole life was probably deciding who's going to live and who's going to die to a certain degree. And so there's always a lot of really, really tough choices to be made in Bharani. And I think even the story of Yama and his sister, it's like that temptation. There's so much of that temptation in Bharani. And then you see like the big gurus like Shivananda. Baba has some, is it? I can't remember what planet I think he's got Jupiter actually. Pump down to there. Yeah, and so I got a lot more pictures and stuff with Jupiter and all there. But anyway, so you see this sort of like with Bharani, there's so much of this temptation and temptation to follow your desires. But that's the very thing. Yesterday you asked me about, you said, oh, well, there's all these guys who are, you know, they're free and they're drinking and they're smoking what they want and they're having sex with who they want, and that's freedom to them. Now, Bharani would kind of say, well, they think they're free, but actually they're being controlled by their senses. They're being controlled by the sort of temptation and the object of their senses. And what Bharani wants to teach us is restraint. And what it is ultimately is the sort of power that we get from restraint. That's true power. That's true freedom, is to be able to restrain your senses. And I think what happens with a lot of people with Bharani placements is they're put in like these just such tempting placements. Now, if we look up, we come back up to the qualities here, I'm sure it was, yeah. We see that Bharani is human. So Bharani is sort of reaching for this kind of wants to be a god, you could say. The humans, you see so many myths where the humans are sort of challenging the gods, but something always sort of happens and brings them back down. They sort of fail in that. And Bharani is probably like those temptations for desires, and because it's still part of Aries, it wants to just act now, right? And it's maybe even that temptation of, oh, it's the last one, you know, it's like act now or it's gone, you know, oh, you'll never get this again, this is last chance. And so it's that strong temptation. And so I think a lot of Bharanis do sort of succumb to that at some point. But they learn the lessons of it. And Bharani is that sort of sense of Tantra. Once in a while, you get this like idea of like, you know, just go and indulge your senses, indulge yourself in that, because what you're going to learn is that it's not worth it. And so you learn to value yourself. You learn to value the things around you. And so you look for something of sort of a sort of higher value. You look for this, you start to seek that out, right? Because you start to sort of see how you interact with the world shows how much value you have in yourself. And that's that sort of Venusian influences in Bharani, is that valuation. And of course, that's why you end up getting a lot of bankers and people like that who have this, collectors, right? I got one guy, he's not quite a banker or collector, but he does storage, but he's storing like people's RVs. He's storing like very high value goods. It's almost the same as being a banker in a way. And he's got sort of this, yeah, it's also very high value storage because he does have these units, very high humidity area sort of thing, but he's got these storage units that are all kind of climate controlled. And so people can leave things there and the humidity is not going to destroy them. So you see these sort of people that they understand value in Bharani. And they make good collectors, very good appraisers of value. But there's a lot of this sort of learning by experience in a way. And so there are sort of consequences to, well, there's certainly consequences to devaluing yourself. There's a lot of so many, oh, wow, Bharani's so many karmic implications come into Bharani. And again, I think this is because I say karmic implications, but Yamaraj is the Dharmaraj. And so he's sort of showing you that this sort of sense of direction. But if we look at the astrology chart, for example, so the 9th house is it's the main house of Dharma. And the 10th house is the main house of your karma. And so in a way, the karma shows the value of your beliefs, in a sense. And I think this is very important with Bharani. And so it's this sort of karma, it's what you're doing shows, it's very Nietzschean in a way. Like Nietzsche used to say that through your activity, what you actually do shows what you value. And this is very true in a way, and especially through Bharani. And so your actions kind of show what you truly, like that's, words are cheap in a way. Action is where there's value. Action is where you really sort of get to a kind of a truth. And I don't know, maybe not a truth, but it's through the actions that you can trust, because trust is very Venusian. And it also has a lot to do with like valuation and all this banking and collecting and storage and things that these natives are doing. And so Bharani's really kind of are dealing with that sort of like, I trust you with my life, right? And so there's a deep trust sort of has to get built. But when there's trust, there's a lot of responsibility. And that's where sort of Saturn seems to sneak into this, right? It's the same with well, that's kind of what consequences teach us, is responsibility. And so you see a lot of this in here. Now, we talked about, like I mentioned, how Bharani's often sort of succumb to that temptation. And that's partially like there's this male elephant is the ruler of this. And the male elephant sort of like, it's known for this, especially in its mating patterns, it's got this must, this stink, this musk in a way, right? It's through the mush that old musk sort of came about in a way. And so it's this musking, it's this, so we find Bharani's, they can sort of have this body odor, but it's almost this, can be a turn on for women, right? It's not, you sometimes say, or women love that. Oh, they love a smell of a stinky man, Well, these are Bharani people, and these are Bharani stink that the women sort of love. The women will have this as well. These sort of pheromones just sort of coming off them, where it's like men are just like, and they can kind of go wild, right? That's what this musking, that's what this elephant sort of mating gets all about, and the males can become very aggressive, and we can see that if we think of like the CEO type or the banker type or something like this, right? They can be very aggressive towards women, because they're like, well, I'm a billionaire, so I can do what I want. But there's also, I think, involved with Bharani and that aggression. It's very hormonal, of course, right? It's this hormones just sort of get going. And these kind of things. We also find the elephant becomes quite important with Bharani. We find a lot of them actually worship Ganesha, and Ganesha becomes quite important with Bharani, especially as they call him the remover of obstacles. And he rides on the little mouse thing, which is the mind, actually, because the little mouse thing, the little chua, they call it, a rodent, basically. It has to, and this is one of the things about rodents, they have to keep chewing on things or their teeth keep growing, and eventually their teeth will kill them. And so they have to keep chewing, and that's why Ganesha rides on the little chua, because he has to, the mind, it has to keep chewing. It's like the cheetah, it's like that, it doesn't stop. But Ganesha can control the mind. He can control that little mouse. He can send it off. Ganesha is also the guardian of the directions, right? So he can send the mind off in whatever direction he wants. He can channel the mind, channeling those energies, sort of thing. And again, that's where the sort of spirituality sort of comes into Bharani. And so you find people, they're really dealing with a lot of this stuff. I would expect, and I saw I know a few of the people, there's some of these people, sexy tantrics, are teaching this very popular technique to restrain the ejaculation quite in a physical manner, right? In a very sexual manner. And I've talked about this restraining the ejaculation, how it metaphor in so many other ways of life. But you find that with Bharani, right? That restraint. And so I find some of these sexy tantrics have these placements. They're trying to restrain that sexual energy. And so there's a lot of ways we can do that through the physical means, through the mental means. Most of you are in the class from yesterday, or through these sort of other, we talked about the means, or spiritual means, or the final means doesn't really deal with Bharani because there's no restraint in the final means, but it's usually through that restraint that you get there, you could say. And so, like I went brahmacharya myself for a number of years. And wow, there's a lot of power to be found in that sort of restraint. It's really, really quite a powerful sort of thing. Now, I can see this. Picasso has Bharani placements. And so I really like the artists who have these placements because they sort of show us this, there's a cubism, there's something a little bit abstract, again, about Bharani, very sort of theatrical in its way, and able to kind of blend these realities in a sense. And there was a few abstract artists, and I think even some of Picasso's students, other cubists, sort of had some Bharani placements. But of course, this is also on war, right? Gorencia, probably pronounced that wrong, but that's okay. And so this was his thing on the Civil War in Spain when like Franco was in. And I'm not really exactly sure. I don't know my history quite well enough, but we get that sort of Civil War. I found it interesting that Saturn is debilitated right in the nourishing point of this nakshatra. And you generally find these nourishing points, all planets usually do fairly well in these nourishing points. But here we find Saturn is debilitated here. And so this makes me think that it's almost like, and we find with Bharani, I mentioned that sort of Saturnius quality to Bharani. But yet he does bad here. And I think the reason he does bad here is actually because I think in a way Saturn himself is very, very strong in Bharani. And so that's very, very bad for us. We don't like that at all. And so he becomes very strong, that sense of sacrifice. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, like I think you'd be too depressed at that point because you'd be too restraintful about partaking into the things.
Exactly. That's just it. Too much of that depression, too much. He really cuts back. I wrote about it more when I was doing the research on that, but this difference between Ashwini and Bharani being the difference between how did I phrase it? Like low oxytocin or low dopamine. And so there's these subtle sort of differences. I think Saturn really doesn't like Ashwini. He really, really doesn't like Ashwini. But he almost likes Bharani. He likes that depth. He likes going deep into the cave. He likes going into that darkness, right? They talk about, there's almost a morbid thing here. And I think from that spiritual perspective, it's like that sort of sense of first you have to sacrifice your life. First you have to die, and then you can be reborn. But here we're really coming to that, well, maybe almost both of those in a sense. They're really like killing things and bringing them back to life, like these nerve regeneration sort of thing. Playing with fire, like I said, that sort of Frankenstein sort of thing. Now, Bhairava, right? He's this sort of fearsome deity, but he's also this most benevolent in a sense. We get this like these masks again. If you go to Nepal, this is more the Nepali image of Bhairava. You see this mask everywhere. It's in all the shops, all the little places. It's this sort of mask of Bhairava. And I think again, it's like you get this Chinese New Year, they're wearing all the masks. You get these Bhairava, they're doing these festivals in the street where they're wearing these sort of masks. And it's really that, again, I talked about like Swami Lakshmanju, right? But his guru, you could say, was Abhinavagupta, who is again mostly known for theater, mostly known on how to draw out those emotions for people. And that's what a lot of the Bhairava Tantras are doing, is really getting to the source point of our sort of emotions, the source point of in Hinduism, Bhairava rides on the dog. The dog is known for its desire. It goes for things no matter what, right? Like it'll die to have sex. It'll die to try to eat some of that dead carcass on the side of the road. His desires just fully take him over. And so it's a sort of sense of first you learn control, you learn all the restraints, and then you can let yourself go. Right? Then you can break the rules. Then you can release yourself in this sense. But first, it's discovering that sort of sense of restraint, those sort of, learn the rules and then you can break them. And I think that's very Bharani. Like, that's why most of the bankers are probably bankers, right? Like Mark Cohen, the French, she was French president, right? I think he is now. He's like, do you think he's following the rules? He learned the rules. He worked for Frank Barclays or someone. Learn the rules so you can break them. The other thing you get with Bharani placements in that regard, we talked about trusts. And so you get these sort of financial trusts or people who are living off trusts. A lot of people have Bharani placements have some money. There's no kind of problem with that. Even if they're living like poor person, a lot of times there's some money in the background somewhere. And so they're kind of dealing with these trusts. So there was a Stephen Carbonara, he was shot and he was one of the French artists. Je suis, what was it? Anyways, the Muslim terrorists went in and killed all those illustrators. He was one of these illustrators. Now, he looks like he was like in this, whatever this picture was taken, he was already afraid of death. He was halfway there, I have 1 foot in the ground almost. We find someone like Spinoza. He was tough, man. I saw pictures of him. Sometimes he's got this big long face. Sometimes he's got this little round face. It's like, how did these artists present them? How close to reality was it? It's hard to say, right? They tried to make them as fashionable, give them the most fashionable look possible, probably, right? You need to make people look good or you don't make your money. So it's hard to say what he really looked like. He was kind of, Ken Wilber was a big philosopher. He described himself actually as a philosophical entertainer. And I think in a way, some of these other philosophers were that. They were writing in, Mark did a funny thing one time, Mark Dachkowski. So we're sitting there and he starts like, he's running down this book. He's like, oh, and it's written in the style of the times that the people like, and people kind of like, it's written in this nice sort of flowery way. And really he's like, this book's only popular because it appeals to the time. It appeals to the fashion sense and the style of philosophy of its time. And whoever wrote it, they probably like, they don't really know anything. They're just writing in that style of what they studied in, and they're copying the styles of their gurus, and that's all it is. And then he's like, and who's the author? Mark Dachkowski. Oh, I wrote this book. But there is that sort of sense in the Bharani. It's that appealing to the style. It's appealing to what's sort of there. And that's what we're doing in theater. We're kind of appealing to the audience. It's actually a lot of focus on the audience sort of comes here, and trying to elicit the sorts of emotions and responses that you want. And so you see a lot of psychologists, a lot of psychoanalysts have this as well, because they're really dealing on that psychological level, behaviorism. Carl Jung had Bharani placements, Sigmund Freud had Bharani placements, Alfred Adler has Bharani placements. Like a lot of these are big guru people in the field of psychology. And so that's a lot of that sort of going on. We saw Swami Lakshmanju up there. He's ultimately like Mark's guru was. Mark met Lakshmanju kind of thing. So that was his most immediate guru for Kashmiri Shaivism. And actually, like, well, the only reason we know anything about Kashmiri Shaivism is because all Lakshmanju's students were all these like PhD translators. And so they went out and sort of, they were learning translation personally, I think through Lakshmanju, but then they all went out and had this, well, they were university professors, so they had a whole field of people to sort of teach to. And so we see a lot again of that lineage sort of movement through, oh, look, Dana has a Rahu, and oh, that's a Shuni. How did I get back there? Come back to Bharani. I was like, hey, look at that. So we get a lot of these sort of things. Again, here we get, well, Pope Clement, I did some, was that here? Yeah. So Pope Clement, you can see, was very old, and so God knows about his birth time, right? But we do what we can. But he was one of the first popes that actually knew one of the apostles. And he was a really, like, he was really adamant of like who had the power in the church and who was the bishop, who was the gatekeeper sort of in the church. And so he was one of these first really, really powerful gatekeepers like that. Yeah, he went to jail, he suffered, right? He followed Christ. The skulls, we see these things with the skulls of these people, even their own bodies. His skull is in one place, his body's in another place. These sort of things are preserved. And in his case, they're like 2 parts of them are in caves, right? It's like, it's so Bharani. these sort of stories of these people, the skull, you know, the philosopher with the skull on the side of his desk, like that's your Bharani philosopher, really dealing with topics of death. In a lot of ways too, if we think of like Bhairava, and we think of Kali, we think of some of these, we think of Shiva dancing on cremation grounds, all of this death, it's like, where's all this coming from? But it's because what they're trying to tell us, in a sense, is that this life, because this life is connected to matter, this life is death. So this life is time. Being in time is being in the realm of death, right? Being in the body is this realm of death. Otherwise, the spirit is this everlasting truth, this everlasting life. And so true life is the life of the spirit, whereas the realm of death and sort of the death cults, you could say, in a very broad way, all the people worshiping money is like worshiping the death goddess. They're worshiping material things. They're trying to store things, to save things, to keep things that are caught in the realm of time. They're trying to make it timeless in a way. But everybody knows, like, that money is going to come to an end. That stuff my friend is storing very delicately, right? Keeping all the humidity out. These things are things, they're just material objects. They came into the world and they're going to die. And Bharanis, I think, they learn these lessons. Like even the bankers learn, they suffer some big losses. They suffer some deaths of this matter, right? And so they learn these lessons kind of very stark way. Like I said, a lot of them had very, very close brushes with death, where so many other people, big catastrophes, so many people were killed, but they lived, they survived. And this has a big effect on a person, man. Take a brush with death, go sit with death for a little while. I think this is why you guys are here, because I don't know how many countless hours, days I've spent sitting myself at the cremation grounds, just watching death, watching bodies burn, seeing that sort of linear timeline for myself. It comes up, it dies, it rises, it falls. It's something with someone, like I traveled my whole life, even as a kid, every few years we moved. And it was like, I never looked back. It was like everything behind me was just a dead thing. And in a way, that's spirituality as well. You want to let go of all of that attachments, in a sense. Now, there's still this, Bharani will never let go entirely, and we shouldn't as well, I don't think. If we want to be working with people, we have to hold on to something. You want to go off in the jungle and live by yourself, and anyways, just let go, no problem. One guru said, just this last time I was 3 years in India, and I told the Babaji, he said, so you're staying in India forever now? And I said, Baba, for some time, I think I thought I was staying in India forever. I thought this passport was going in the river. But my mother is still alive, and I couldn't do that to my mama. So I'm going to go back to Canada, and at least I'll say hello. And when mama dies, then I'm free to do everything. And Baba laughed. He said, this is the same for every Baba. You can become as much Baba as you want. You can never let go of your mother. And so Bharani shows us there's always these connections. There's nothing is for free, in a sense, with Bharani. And so that's what it comes, if you want to live in this world, if you want to be teachers, if you want to be kind of dealing with other people, there's consequences to that. There's karmic consequences to everything. Of course, there's karmic consequences up in the jungle, but those aren't bound up with other people, right? There's no, if you go sit by yourself on the top of Mount Kailash, there's nobody else there. There's nobody, your karma, there's no other responsibilities. It's just you. But especially in Bharani, there's some other responsibility. But on the other side, it's that sort of tantric idea where we're going to learn from the other. We're going to learn from that other side. Through taking that responsibility, we're going to well, we're going to sacrifice something. In a way, Bharani has a lot to do with that sacrifice, because it's like you get this headless energy of Ashwini, and then you get this, like, in a sense, it's like, well, now I have to choose something. And there's consequences to every choice, because whatever you choose to do means you didn't choose to do all the other stuff. Right? And so that's where Nietzsche says, well, there's value in your choice because you chose to do that. Right? It's like the wife who's maybe complaining about the husband always working. It's like, well, you choose to go to work. Right? You could come and visit your family, but you choose that. And so there's like, wow, there's choice, and there's so much power in choice, because every choice is a sacrifice. Every choice means I can't do all of that because I'm doing this. And there is a kind of imminence, I think, especially to the Aries nakshatras. And so these sorts of things come in, hey, that life and death sort of imminence. And that's what it is, it's these choices. See so many people, this architect dealing with cryptography. I found a lot of people were dealing with sort of ancient symbols and ancient things. Again, it's that historical aspect, but this cryptography is like, what are they trying to use? This guy was maybe dealing with, well, it's Renaissance. Anyways, dealing with some sort of ancient languages, right? Trying to sort these out, trying to understand what signs and symbols are. And Bharani, of course, in occultism sort of has a lot to do with that. Really. Now it gets highlighted really with like something like, I don't have my chat open, but someone said something. Oh, my spelling's wrong. Somewhere. Guarenca, anyways. So there's this sort of thing with Bharani, trying to understand those sort of ancient symbols. And I mentioned like even Picasso, that comes up, right? It's sort of this cryptic sort of cubist, like, what is this? I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to see a Picasso painting in reality. This is actually really a treat. And some of these great artists, like, to see their work in reality is just like, wow. And you look at it and it's like, there's these patterns that they don't mean anything on the surface, but it's almost like you have this emotional reaction just to the way that line is curved somehow. And it's they're really, really quite powerful. Great artists are great artists for a really good reason. Really, they are. And so there's some of that in Bharani. It's this sort of cryptic sort of messaging. And you don't understand why it's powerful, but it's very, very powerful. Sort of a thing. A few of these people, actually quite a few of them, are also dealing with insurance. Now insurance is interesting because, okay, on the one hand, it's like they're kind of dealing with maybe life insurances and injury and accident, and so a lot of this darkness. But in a sense, that insurance adjuster is the gatekeeper. They decide who gets the insurance money or not, right? They're the ones between. They're making some families rich and giving them lots of money, and other families are saying, no, I'm sorry, suffer, your family, wherever they died, isn't covered, and go away and leave me alone. And so there's this, like, there's a lot of cruelty, you can say, in the insurance adjusting business, at least for the people who are kind of adjudicating is a very good word, adjudicating claims. You see a lot of lawyers have this. I mentioned the scientists already have it, sort of judges and justices. A lot of justice sort of topics come up into here. See Sri Rama Maharishi, Yukteswar Giriji. Now, this is an important thing too for tantric purposes, I guess, or tantric studies. So Mars. We're going to go into Mars in the next class and the other course, of course, but we see Mars and Bharani here. And one of the things we think, oh, Mars is very strong in a chart. He's in his own sign, he's exalted. We think, oh, this very masculine man going around and just sleeping with all the women and really just like penetrating everything and everywhere he can, just like Mars is just going for it, breaking boundaries and very aggressive and rah. That's not true at all for Mars. When Mars is exalted, when Mars is in his own house, he's usually brahmacharya. He's usually has that restraint. And that's where Mars becomes powerful. It's because of that restraint that he becomes a great master. And so you can see Maharishi, Yukteswar, they're dealing quite directly with restraints of also with their sexual powers. But we see these guys like Edward Smith Osborne and Eddie Gallagher. They're basically the same. Edward Smith was also a NATO something. And again, some of these guys, I don't have exact birth times for them, but still, this is the nakshatra, so it should still ring true. And so these guys are powerful, deadly killers because of their restraint. Mars is all about timing, right? And so Bharani restrains them until just the right moment. They don't give in to their temptations. And so that's what makes Mars very, very powerful in Bharani that way. These guys are killing people. I'm not sure if there's any mass murders here. I'm just looking very quickly. Well, Albert Fish was a mass murderer, but if we pull up his chart, we'll probably see it.
Was there?
Someone said something, but I couldn't hear.
Hitler.
Oh, Hitler. Oh, yeah, there's another one. There's another mass murder. So, yeah. So we get a couple killers who got a little bit out of control. And so there was probably other placements with their charts that would give them that. We can just pull Hitler's chart up very quickly. Sort of see that. Can you see Hitler's chart now, or do I have to make it so you can share? Okay. I'm just going to skip out like that for a quick second. Come back in. So we see, there we go. Now you can see it, I think. Try to make it bigger if I can. So we see someone like Hitler's chart might be an exception to that. That role. He has Ketu as aspecting as Mars. It's also Mercury. Mercury usually doesn't do very well with Mars. Saturn is also aspecting that Mars. And so we see here, we see the exception, right? Where these people are generally very, very restrained, whereas Hitler had Saturn and Ketu especially making problems with his Mars, but Mercury's also making problems for Mars. So it's not very comfortable at all. We see this is kind of interesting. He's got the Venus there also with Mars. Venus and Mars are interesting. Materialistic people, from a materialistic standpoint, Venus and Mars are really, really good. From a spiritual standpoint, it's not very good because you don't have any restraint. Because it kind of brings in, we talked about the temptations of Bharani. Well, Venus kind of brought in too much temptation. And for Hitler, you could say it was that temptation of, wow, you can do anything you want in a way. And so he succumbed to it, and probably because Ketu and Saturn are also aspecting. And so he just went off the rails, right? He just went crazy, went quite crazy doing whatever the heck he wanted. So we can see some of the exceptions here in that way. We might even find it, I don't know, with these NATO generals that we looked at too, because they can be, they can also be, wait, I'll bring one of his up. There, now you can see it. Sorry about that. So we get this. Just going to open his thing up on the side, chart notes, and see who the heck this guy is. So this was guy, yeah, elite military, basically, elite military general, highest position you can possibly attain in the British military, I believe, right? One of the Queen's Guards. He's Ashlesha, and so that had some of it. But we see here, he has all these Bharani placements in his 10th house. And well, Mars and Jupiter. And so that's why he attained such a high position as a lifeguard. He's got Saturn there. Saturn, Ketu, both aspecting. So we see again, he's a little bit probably in that gray zone where he could kind of do anything he wanted with that power. And no doubt he probably abused his power as well as a NATO general, right? As we know, NATO generals have abused their powers as well. Like, it's like, God, you start looking at these astrology charts, right? And you see someone like Hitler and you think, oh my God, that's awful. And then you see someone on the NATO and right away you almost have a little bit more you think, oh, he's a great general. Whereas Hitler, you think, oh, he's a mass murderer. But like, come on, what's the difference between a NATO general and Hitler these days? Not very much, I don't think, right? It's very, very, very fine line. It's really the judgment of history, you could say, has tarnished Hitler and made these other guys great. But the level of indiscriminate killing and power hungriness, and probably even like in our modern world, that's having a bit of a sadistic sort of temperament is going to get you to the top in a sense. And I think that might even be again a sort of temptation that we see in Bharani placements, because there's a lot of that sort of darkness going on in Bharani, and a lot of really, really tough decisions. And some of you in those life experiences, quite a few people have Bharani placements who are murder victims as well, right? Killed by the husband. Another guy, what's that guy? Sid Vicious. He was a punk rocker, but in the end, he ended up killing his girlfriend, and then he took his own life. Whether that was on purpose or he just did too many drugs because he was celebrating the death of his girlfriend. There's some blind there, but anyways, he crossed all those lines of life and death. And there is that sort of sense of like, found a lot of the killers that were here was like killed his girlfriend, killed his wife, she killed her husband. There's another guy, he was like a Fox News executive. His wife killed him with Bharani placements. And you see this sort of like, in a way, what's the difference between love and hate, right? You see those extremes of passion, but the attachment between extreme love and extreme hate is the exact same, right? And the amount of control that you have given the other person is also the same, right? You're just overwhelmed by that love. You're overwhelmed by that hate, and you kind of give your power away to the love, to the hate, to the other person. And so it's really kind of like, it's Bharani is these kind of dark differences, you could say, or how these extremes sort of end up being the same. Again, love, extreme hate. And it's really, really, it's such an interesting nakshatra, Bharani. I don't have any placements in it, but it's like, wow, I'm still very impressed by it. And it really, like, I feel very close to Bharani still, even though I don't have those close placements. Found a lot of, I mentioned the scientists, a lot of psychologists, but there was just like Eugene Lamb, he was working on nuclear physics sort of thing and nuclear reactors kind of stuff. Again, some of these guys you don't have exact birth times for, but I find their work so fascinating, right? I bring them into the Nakshatra project anyways. And so, of course, these guys are like, well, you're making nukes, man. You're dealing with life and death, right? You're dealing with, but it's also, even these nukes is kind of this double-edged sword, because it provides this power. And that's the temptation, that power, right? And even for a nuclear physicist, okay, he's just some nerd working in the lab, but he's so overwhelmed by, he wants this overwhelming power. And even these days, you get these kind of like, on the climate side, they're like all focused on carbon, right? And they're like, oh, we got to be carbon neutral, so let's build nuclear power plants. And it's like, well, that's not. Right? And I'm not saying carbon is good, and that's one of the problems. It's one of those early things we face in modern life, and as humans, you could say, is like, in order to, there's two things that are like really, really difficult to sort out as humans. And one is the power thing. And it's like, how do we cook our food and make heat without sort of destroying around us and making this air pollution? And then the other side of that, I'm not sure if this has to do with Bharani, but it kind of does in a way. Because Bharani's all these taboos, and so it's also our shit, it's our waste product. And it's like, what do we do for these things? It's like, no matter how much we even try to eliminate our, say, carbon footprints or any of this sort of stuff, in order to survive, in order for life to kind of cook food, which is, there's debates on cooked food, whether or not it's necessary, but it's sort of, our digestive system really likes it when our food is cooked. Right? Yeah, go ahead. You got a question.
Just to kind of confirm, it sounds like Bharani is really about exploring both sides of the polarity and then getting blindsided by the other side of what the one side they really go persistently in, because they're so convinced on one side, so they push the boundary. So they're disciplined in continuing to always push that boundary in the same way that like Taurus is, right? Like they just go blind and just go in that one direction in a passionate way.
Yeah, well, there is exactly. There's a lot of passion all the time in Bharani. And it's sort of like, I think in their lives, they dance with the devil sort of thing in Bharani. There is sort of that thing. And that's what a lot of Tantra, we're kind of dancing with temptation a lot of time. We're dancing with that devil. We're dancing with a lot of power issues come in, right? With Bharani. And so it's that, well, wow, money and power and fame, these are like, this is kind of what we all want, and we all think we can handle it until we get it, until it's ours. And then it's like, well, geez, now I got some, like, you got that temptation. Now I got some choice to make. Now it's like, now I'm here to make that choice sort of thing. Now, whether or not I fall for the temptation or not. Yeah, and that's like, I think in Bharani, a lot of that power is that gatekeeper sort of power. And that's the power of being the gatekeeper sort of thing. If you're the one that decides who's in and who's out, well, that's something. That's something.
And like when you're saying like the banker too, where he has access to give all of this money, all of that. So like that's a temptation that at any point he can just choose, I'm gonna let it rip here kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, it was it's funny. Life has a way of telling me very quickly. So I started thinking this morning, I was like, well, you know, if I had because one of my clients in India, he was like, well, Baba, he says, I'm almost tempted to fly you back to India so you can just work and be my mentor. Right? He's a corporate guy and he's trying to start these new businesses and going into all of this sort of stuff. And for some reason, I thought to myself, yeah, well, I could kind of do a business. I could borrow some money and kind of do a big business or something like this. And then Inda Astro sent me a message, and they reminded me that Jupiter just entered my sixth house, which is debts. And it was like, can I have kind of problems with that? And they're like, oh, the problems with those debts would really come out in September. Between September, Jupiter goes retrograde between September and November. I think I can't remember the exact dates. But and then so it was like, you could really have problems with debt then. And I was like, okay, Mike, just don't then. Don't borrow any money off anyone. But that's that temptation of credit, of debt, of like, oh, I can get all this money now. There's consequences. You have to pay that back, right? When it's a loan, it's like, you have to pay it back. Now, I have Ketu in my sixth house, so that's cloudy area, whether or not I have to pay that back, but I always have the best of intentions. Um, But really, it's okay to lend me money, guys. So,
Me
no,
too, me too. Yeah.
yeah. So, that's why I ask for donations or grants or things like that instead of, instead of asking to borrow. But that Bharani is that borrowing, and it's that power to lend money, right? There was a show, I just went through Canada, I watched a bunch of Netflix, and I watched that Lucifer one. I don't know if you guys saw that Lucifer one, but that's the devil, right? People come to him and for favors, and he's like, yeah, I'll do what you need. But when I need a favor, and that's Bharani. Thank God I have no Bharani placements, it would kill me. The devil would have my soul for sure. But that's Bharani. Bharani is that, like, yeah, I'll do you a favor. Yeah, I can do that for you, kind of thing. And so you get some of this, maybe even some mobsters. I'd have to look and see, but I can see that sort of gangster energy being in Bharani of really, I think most of them at some point, whether it's they sell their soul to the devil or if they just sort of dance with the devil. And Bharani, there's a fine line in Bharani, and they're certainly dancing on that line. They're certainly, and that's again that, like the Bhairava dance, the Vijana Bhairava, that space in between, that fine line in between being a saint and a sinner. You can think of that Lucifer program on television, like he's supposed to be the devil, but he's one of the angels also. And so there's always that really, really fine line with Bharani. Of course, other things push them over the line, other placements, other aspects. So there's that very fine line with that. Wow, yeah. It's like Tamerlane, he was a lot like Genghis Khan, you could say. And he was, they say, nobody knows this stuff, but they say he was of Genghis Khan's lineage. And he started out, he was a Muslim, and so he started out as this great defender of the Muslim faith. And so he was going around, and he would just like wipe out whole cities of people. He's hated in India because he completely wiped out, like, Hindu culture, has completely killed so many people in New Delhi, wiped these people out. But then towards the end of his reign, he started to really, like, even the Muslims, he'd go and conquer a Muslim city or a Muslim village and just wipe all of them out as well. And so he was quite a brutal sort of character. Death was certainly at his door. Chuck Norris brings to someone in Elena T. She's also she's a Kashmiri Shaivist, you can say, and studies astrology and a lot of that sort of stuff. Chuck Norris, it's interesting to see him here. Now, there's another thing. I don't know if his birth time's right. I'd have to pull his chart out and kind of look, but there's another thing that comes up with Bharani placements is well, a few architects have it, but what do these people study?
Sorry, Mike, we are still seeing the astro chart from Edward Smith.
Oh,
we can't
are you?
see the document.
Okay, yeah, thanks for telling me. It's got to be a way
You're
I can just share my whole screen with you. Okay, well, anyway, so we're back to that. Sorry about that. So I think you can see it now. So you see this, what are we dealing with here? This is Mars in the fifth, yeah. And so we got Mars in the fifth. And so you got that, anyways, Chuck Norris, you might say roughly a celebrated fighter, celebrated warrior, same as Tamerlane in a way, a celebrated, well, he was a defender of the faith. And Chuck Norris kind of is too. I'm not sure if he is a Christian, but he's sort of one of those like Texas good old boys, right? To kind of protecting the old ways in a sense. Alina T a little bit that way as well. Like I said, she's a Kashmiri Shaivist. We see the Thich Nhat Hanh. We see him here as well. I think he would probably, he's one of these, I call him like a corporate guru. He's one of these kind of corporate gurus and quite revered. But I think like a lot of guys like him, I think in places like Burma, he's also been very involved politically and probably also decided whether people lived or died, quite literally. But the thing I wanted to bring up about Chuck Norris is it brings up another thing. There's a lot of, what are they, geologists, people that study the ground underneath the ground and sort of that deep, dark underground stuff. Now, Chuck Norris, you want to know how he fits in. He actually discovered, this is fascinating about him, and it matches with so many of his nakshatra placements. He discovered this ancient artesian sort of spring water underneath of his land. And it's like really ancient. It's down like way, way down there and really sort of, and so now he sells this water. He tapped into this water source. And so there's like in the US, there's like Chuck Norris water. I can't remember what it's called, but it's literally like Chuck Norris has his own brand of water, but it's this ancient underground sourcing. Now he has some, I think it's Purva Bhadrapada placements as well that also sort of relate with this, but so he's got this, it's like this superfood water kind of a thing. I'm going to try it. If I go to Texas, I'm going to try some Chuck Norris water. Probably really expensive, but anyways, it'll give me Chuck Norris powers, right? So let's do it. So this is interesting. I've got this name, Thomas Beattie here. It's the pregnant man. Right, this was maybe the first pregnant man. I don't know when. I think this was in the 80s, actually. Right, all this transgender stuff's really popular now, and everybody's going online and going like, a man can't get pregnant. Well, here we go, the pregnant man in my astrology. Sorry, guys. So they insert this in his stomach, I'm sure, something like that. But it's like, I'm going to pull that guy's chart out because this is very strange, right? Because Mars and Bharani and in Aries, you think, oh, here's a very masculine, manly man. And now he is very masculine. He carries a beard and all that sort of stuff. So he is on some things. Is that Thomas Beattie? Yeah, Thomas Beattie. So I'll get better at the whole moving the sharing thing around. But it should be coming up here. And so I think they did have an AA rated birth time for this guy. And so the time should be correct. Is it? All right, so like that. So this is his fifth house of children. And so he's got all these planets there. So some kind of insemination. He's got the Saturn, the ruler of it, coming over here with Ketu. And it's interesting. It's almost like Mars. It's almost like his sense of masculinity. When, okay, all you guys do whatever you're doing, I'm staying out of it in a way, right? Because he's not involved with any of these planets. He's not, well, Rahu's aspecting him, and so giving some unusualness. And Mars would be he's in that eighth house, in that surgery house in a way. And this guy was probably the breakthrough surgery sort of thing for inseminating a baby into a man. This sort of very unusual thing. And I mentioned even that sort of like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, that like I think a lot of like stem cell research? Anyways, a lot of the genetic research also comes into play with Bharani. And so it's like, well, come on, if you're impregnating men, it's a way you're really dancing with the devil in a way, like you're really trying to go against nature in some sense of way. And there's going to be consequences to that. And we can kind of see it in society to a certain degree, how those consequences have played out. But I'm sure also in his own life, there's probably all sorts of crazy hormonal things. And well, he did get, I mentioned here, he got the sex change. He got the artificial insemination. 4 times he got an artificial inseminated children. Oh, but there's probably all kinds of hormonal things and anyways, difficulties that he's having with his own body. The male body wasn't made to carry a child, for example. part of the reason women have all these heaviness in the hips is even just for the back to kind of hold up that big gut. And that extra weight. And I'm not sure, I would have to do the math or do the research on this, but I have a feeling that like a baby in your stomach probably weighs a lot more than, like, you see those big beer gut guys with the big round belly, they look like they're pregnant. I'll bet you the baby weighs a lot more. So anyways, we get this sort of thing going on with these kinds of charts. And so we do see the Rahu, we see Mars also in the 8th house. Mars also for a Virgo ascendant isn't a good planet. And so you see some that normal sort of Mars and Aries, that's very, usually again, those Mars placements, exaltations are the healthier versions of masculinity, you could say. And so again, when there's an exception, I always want to look into that and see just why. Again, there's that sense of transformation, surgical transformation with Mars in the 8th house here as well. So it's quite interesting. 8th house is also the sex organs. Now, we get as well, a lot of times when we get transitioning, and I've seen it both ways, male to women and women to male, is the 3rd house having to deal with the breasts. Right, and a lot of times, of course, he went from, what did he do? Yeah, this is a man who got transitioned into a woman, and so he got fake breasts put on, that Rahu. And then I see a lot of times you'll see these 4th house stuff will come to the 11th house, and that can be a lot of like the breast surgeries and breast removals. So, anyways, so just some sort of Bharani. Again, it's always the exceptions. When I'm doing research, it's always the exceptions that sort of catch my eye and make me go, oh, well, why like this? Why is that guy like that? Now, I'm going to skip ahead to Mercury here. We see, oh, wait, let's skip too far ahead. So we see with the Mercury placement, we find a little bit more, I find more of the lawyers, Rudy Giuliani, Islamabad Kingdom, Brunei, he was an engineer, but you find that Mercurial sort of thing coming in. And you also get this, there seems to be some fire. A lot of times, there's in these Bharani placements, like Isambard Kingdom Brunei, he was an engineer, but he was dealing with steel. He was building some of these like early sort of engineering marvels out of steel. And so working around the welders and making these like great big chains with, well, the links would be like massive sort of things. I've got his picture coming up down here. He was quite interesting. You see all of these people, let's scroll up to this. Just about all of these people are dealing with some kind of tantra, mysticism, occultism, all of that sort of stuff. Rudy Giuliani, like I said, he was a lawyer. So did Weisenstein. John Stuart Mill, I think he was essentially a lawyer as well. Detective with Conan O'Doyle, but still it's that lawyer mind, right, that he had. Betty Ford wasn't a lawyer, but she was in jail. Get a few of that. Kasparov, usually quite intelligent, a lot of intelligence with Mercury and Bharani for understanding both sides. And I think Mercury does quite well in the Bharani part of Aries in particular, because Mercury is good at assessing both sides of things and sort of, yeah, again, the lawyer has to know his case, but to be a good lawyer, you have to know what the other side is going to bring up. You have to know all of that. And really, the lawyers and dealing with judgment and all of that sort of stuff really comes out strong in Bharani. But I noticed it quite strong with Mercury and Bharani. We see someone like Osama bin Laden has it here, Calamity Jane. Osama bin Laden, he's one of these characters that's heavily demonized in the West, while in the Eastern or some of the Muslim world, being really raised as being like the what you can say, the freedom fighter sort of character. And he was known as being quite a philosopher as well. But anyways, like a lot of these people, deciding who's going to live and who's going to die. Michael Arth, he was a black magic, but he was also, he killed some people, a lot of smuggling sort of stuff. Okay, the masks, I think, with the smuggling. Spike Milligan was a comedian, but a lot of really dark humor sort of thing. Spike Milligan, I have him there. Mark came along one day, I can't remember, he started telling me all these stories about Spike Milligan. So Spike Milligan was one of Mark's old classic favorite comedians. So we get that in here. We get this something with Bharani and Mercury and Bharani. Now I really highlight it with when this Mercury was in the 8th house in Bharani. But there's a lot of almost, especially with the 8th house placement, this kind of circus freak thing with the Mercury in the 8th house. I think it ruled the 1st house in that case. There you go. So, yeah, we got Andre the Giant here. Rudy Giuliani is a little bit different, but he's a lawyer, but he's still like a little bit sort of dwarfish in a way. You get this sort of, and the reason the 8th house especially is because I believe it rules the 1st, ruling the 1st house, the 1st lord in the 8th house. These people kind of shock you a little bit. They surprise you a little bit. And they're a little bit odd. And the Mercury there makes it so that they become they're a little bit of a joke. They can get a lot of fun made at them. Like Andre the Giant, right? He's kind of the circus freak, Mr. T, right? The spiked hair and, hey man, what's up? I can't remember what he used to say, but anyways, the big Mr. T sort of tough guy thing. Right, he was a tough guy, but it was like he was a joke, man. Like, come on, really, Mr. T? And so you get that sort of thing with the Mercury and Bharani. And so there is that joking. So the comedian, like Spike Milligan had that. But it's interesting. We see Andre the Giant, we see Emma Watson. They were in that show together where everybody was kind of, show was kind of a joke, but it became a kind of a cult classic to people. Can't remember the name of it. But they basically played themselves, right? The big giant freak, and it's kind of a fairy tale sort of a movie in a way. Calamity Jane, again, she was a cowboy. I think she was a bit of a killer, but she was kind of a joke also. Sid Vicious, he was this punk rocker. Funny, Mr. T also they both had the big spiked hair. But they were kind of a joke, man. Like, come on, really? Big spike hair and pink hair, and you want me to take you seriously? And these sort of that punk rock sort of like thing, circus freakish a little bit. Just like that with Bharani. But I found out with most of the Mercury Bharani, there was something, what could you say? I think because of ruling 1st house, it was something almost seemed inauthentic about them. It's like they're just playing out their story in a way. And so it's hard to kind of take them seriously. Now, really, Giuliani, he's a big lawyer and he did all that stuff, but he's still he became now this sort of Trump rah, and like nobody takes Rudy Giuliani seriously anymore. He was the mayor and he did a lot of good things. But hard to take him seriously. He just became a joke in a way. Some of these daredevils as well got Hugh Armstrong, but yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Andrea.
It's just funny because I was just reading about Sid Vicious. Oh yeah, it's just funny because I was just reading about Sid Vicious, and like there was one point where like Freddie Mercury was in a room, and Sid Vicious came in. He was like, "Hey, so what's up with your little ballet music?" And Freddie Mercury was like, "Aren't you Stanley the fearsome or something?" And he took him by the collar and threw him out of the room. Like through Sid Vicious, he like gave him a taste of his own medicine. So Sid Vicious was trying to be all freaking like punky and and mean, and then Freddie Mercury like put him back. It's just a very Bharani like kind of
Yeah,
thing,
it's
right?
exactly that. So yeah, a big tough guy, but just yeah, get out of here. Yeah, it's just you're
Yeah.
a joke, man. Like you're nothing. And so Mercury Bharani is a little bit that way. Um, yeah, George Carlin has that. So you see these kind of comedians as well. Hugh Armstrong, I mentioned, he was a daredevil, but I think Evil Knievel or Evil Knievel's son had some of these Mercury Bharani placements as well. Cher, and it's like even her, it's like, well, she was beautiful, but she was also kind of a joke in a way, because she was, it's almost like she knows all the parts to be sexy, and so she was sexy. But she's like, yeah, come on, Cher, like, yeah, get a life in a way, right? Grow up or something with Bharani in a way. So so it's like it's hard to really take Cher seriously, right? She's just this image, Cher. And so you kind of see that with a lot of these Mercury Bharani placements. Kind of imaging. Who's that? No. Betty Ford. It's almost like they're like a caricature of themselves in a way. Kind of an odd placement, that Mercury and Bharani. Jupiter, I think this is where we get into some of the, yeah, we get into a lot of the bankers. I think two or three of the Rothschilds had Jupiter and Bharani, and that's like that expansion. Jupiter does very well for wealth and profits and all of that, and Bharani. Joseph Conrad, also like that Heart of Darkness was Joseph Conrad's like most famous book. And that's about like kind of like you're going into this heart of darkness. He went into these places of fear in a way. He went and followed his fear, and he probably had quite an amazing collection of all these sort of strange things that he gathered. I'd have to have a look at that, but again, you can kind of see their charts here. Chris Rock as well. A lot of controversy. He kind of goes in to the darkness as well and says a lot of sort of taboo things. Now he had a funny thing, and I think this relates with Bharani to a certain point. I don't know the exact details of it. I think it was HBO. He had some kind of contract, and that's where he became big. Like Chris Rock show became this massive thing. And something funny in his contract meant that HBO was making $10 million and he made 10,000, kind of an idea. And so it was just sort of consequences. But he ended up fighting back and he got a whole bunch of money back, but he kind of got it in this sort of lump sum instead of drawing out over the years. And so there's something of this, like, talked about like people with insurance that have this. Trusts are usually, well, they can be given out, like say while papa's still alive, you might, right, sign your will over to a trust while you're living, you could say. But a lot of times that money, when the person dies, it goes over into a trust. And so there's that sort of inheritance thing that comes in. And in a way, that was an inheritance for Chris Rock when he won that case. This here, I was trying to show, yeah, he's got Jupiter in the first house. We see Jupiter in the second house. We see these guys with these sort of big, meaty heads on their shoulders, because the second is kind of big. And so you could see that, these big puffs. But then they're also Pisces. Pisces is Jupiter ascendant sort of people. And so they have that sort of bulk of Jupiter. But then when Jupiter goes into the second like that, it gives them this really like, they're really big guys, right? They make a big impression. So you kind of get that with this placement. And then I'm sure, yeah, here's a second. I'm sure all these guys, John Lennon had it as well. They'll have a lot of really good money. Someone's like, here we see Jeffrey Epstein with it from Moon, Andy Warhol. Again, I talked about that sort of abstractness of Bharani, Andy Warhol. He was shot. I don't think she killed him, but his girlfriend shot him actually. She was sort of a militant feminist. Pretty sure she has Bharani placements as well. And we'll get to her. He's kind of one of those early militant sort of 60s, all the men can die, the patriarchy should die sort of thing. We see some wrestlers and people with this Jupiter Bharani. I think generally they tend to be a little bit bigger people, Jupiter and Bharani placements. Yeah, I know Sangeeta's living from trust. Martin Sheen, Ranabir, Fun. So we see again, people tend to be a little bit stockier somehow with this Jupiter and Bharani. They all seem to be. Brandon Lee was maybe an exception to that stockiness. Fourth from Moon. Francis also. Interesting, Francis, we think about Bharani. Francis does actually a lot of tunneling work. He's a sort of a surveyor, a numbers guy, but his work involves like boring into the ground and this sort of making the caves basically. So that's kind of an interesting placement there. He's always lives in some kind of underground place as well, squatting a lot, or lives out of a van and kind of parking on job sites, parking illegally, a lot of that sort of stuff. Yeah, Gary Gilmore, you can see he demanded death penalty. It's funny, actually, a lot of these people I see with fourth, Emma Goldman was mostly wanted by the law. She was an anarchist. Francis, more or less an anarchist. Gary Gilmore, can't remember what his crimes are, but he wanted the death penalty for him, so pretty heinous somehow. It's quite a dark placement here. And a lot of, again, kind of dealing with the law. There's some seems to be some criminality involved. I know Francis, he was a drug dealer a little bit. Emma Goldman always wanted by the law. Oh, interesting. John Lennon wasn't wanted. He didn't break the law, but for him and for a sense, like we think of that story of Yama and Yamaraj, brother and sister. We see the Western story of Hades and Persephone. And so you see this like kind of older and younger matches going with Bharani placements, much older, much younger, kind of this old hell dog, right? This kind of old man who's not very pretty at all with the young, beautiful woman. You'll see some of that. And of course, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, they were famous for that sort of pairing up. So you kind of see that. I noticed a lot of Bharani placements. Speaking of the old hell dog, a lot of Bharani placements, they tend to like dogs. And a lot of times they have some like sort of ugly beast of a dog that people are a little bit afraid of to a certain degree. And it's like that dog is the gatekeeper in a sense. That dog will tell you who's nice and who's not nice. And that dog will let people in the house who are allowed in the house and that sort of thing. And so it becomes this sort of protector. Just like the old hell dog is guarding the gates of hell. You can see Putin also very much dealing with who can live and who can die. Pope Alexander to a certain tendency. Yeah, again, it's like that. It's like with Putin, like Putin's ultimately, he's like an Orthodox Christian, but he kills people. And you find that a lot with these Jupiter placements where they're quite spiritual people, but they have this dark side, but they kill people. So it's like the tantric. It's like they're going to church, they're doing all the prayers, they're following all the spiritual practices, but they're also breaking the rules. They're eating meat, they're having sex, they're drinking booze, they're doing whatever they want, sort of thing, in a sense. And that sort of lack of rules kind of comes out. Again, that whole story of Yama and Yami, we see that with Jeffrey Epstein having placements in here. I think someone like Courtney Love, I think she knew Jeffrey Epstein, kind of got some placements for him. Here's the other Rothschild with these kind of Bharani placements. Jupiter going into the 8th. That'll be a lot of hidden wealth and sort of things like that. We get someone like that dancing with the devil stuff. Again, Rothschilds, the bankers. I'm sure they did lots of favors. Someone like Roosevelt also. Alexei Navalny, probably pronounced that horribly wrong, but he's that sort of, they call him in the West, they call him the Russian opposition figure, sort of thing. But he's, I think, in this position where, for one reason or other, and probably by his own greed, he almost has to do whatever the West has told him to do. And so he sort of danced with the devil, right? It's like, well, you're a Russian, but you're kind of dancing with America. And it's like, even in his case, there's a sort of sense where a lot of people don't think he's doing breaking anything laws. And if he is breaking the laws were made for him, to put him in jail, sort of thing. And so there's a lot of controversy, and a lot of these people have so much controversy surrounding them. Dr. Dre, like, he's a big musician guy, but he's this big drug dealer dude, revered by everybody, but he's a gangster. There we go. Here's Matisse's name. Dick Cheney, another gangster. Dan Aykroyd played a lot of sort of gangster sort of figures. Henry Matisse, he was an artist, but he was almost like, he was almost a gangster figure as well. And then Francis and Zoe, again, I know Francis doesn't mind breaking laws. I imagine Zoe has probably broken a few herself, certainly dancing on any lines of legalities. Could say that sort of thing. We look at Eddie Vedder. This is maybe a good example. He's got a nice song. Oh, I don't know if it's a nice song. It's kind of a sad song, actually. And it's a song of like, he's singing to society. I think that's the name of the song, Society. And he's like, I hope you get along well without me, because I'm out of here, man. I want nothing to do with you, kind of thing. And there is that kind of sense with Jupiter and Bharani placements where they don't want to have anything to do with that main part of society. And so we see that through Vedder, we see that even through Matisse, kind of these alternative underground movements. Really, that's what that's what Bharani's all about, but that's often what Bharani is about, is not wanting to get away from society to a certain degree. Andy Warhol, right? He was all counterculture. He painted like the pink Mao or something like that with makeup on, or something wild like that. He was really wild sort of stuff. And very, like we see Hugh Armstrong Robinson, that daredevil. It's like that. With Jupiter there, I think they're kind of daring people with their ideas to a certain degree, using their ideas as a risk. Edward Smith Osborne, well, if he was the ruler of NATO, his main job was to spread ideology and really tempt people with the whole American ideology in a sort of a sense. And so quite interesting when we kind of sort of cross these lines over a little bit. Fraser's another one. He was actually also a drug dealer, didn't mind breaking any rules at all. But again, someone like him, everybody would say, oh, but Fraser's a really nice guy. All right, he's not really doing anything wrong. Well, he's breaking the law. It's not a big deal, but we all done it at some point in our life. I got confused about my visa dates again here in whatever country I'm in, Guatemala. And so I've overstayed my visa. And so I'm also breaking the law, right? But you guys be like, yeah, but it's Mike. He didn't really mean to break the law. And so that's kind of Bharani sort of stuff, right? It's like, oh, it's not a big deal though. Bobby Hatfield was a drummer, metal band drummer. I think he played with a metal band. And so quite literally, he probably danced with the devil on stage, right? A mock-up of a devil or something like that. Actually, Fraser's also a drummer. That sort of thing. So it kind of comes in. So time is going very quick. I'm just going to skip ahead. Here we are already to Venus. And so we look at Venus for a moment. We see right off the bat in Venus and Bharani, we see like, Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot is a great play. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's worth reading. It's really, really nice play. Kind of funny, kind of absurdist, I guess. But most of his writing and plays were very dark. Like Waiting for Godot is waiting for death. He had these other, The Executioner, I think, and it's someone who just got out. You're not even sure what he got out of, a mental hospital or jail or whatever, but he can't bear to face anyone. And so he starts begging, and doesn't take care of himself at all. He doesn't clean himself. He doesn't really feed himself very well. He doesn't even go to the washroom. He just goes to the washroom in his pants eventually. And he dies through this sort of, in a sense, it's almost halfway. He dies through the apathy of living, apathy of like just laziness in a sense. But he dies ultimately through this sense of deep self-loathing, as if like nobody would ever I'm no good for anything. And he slowly wants to hide himself to this point where he doesn't even want people to see his real hand out there begging. He attaches to kind of a stick to a cup, and he's hiding his face. And anyways, his face is, because he's not showering or anything, he's got all these sort of skin diseases and falling apart. So that was Samuel Beckett, right? It's very kind of Bharani, gory, sort of Waiting for Death. The second guy there is Church of Satan. Like, come on, Bhairava. The most orthodox people, all this Tantra is the devil, man. Bhairava is as devilish as you could get. I was once, was a Muslim. She was raised Muslim and sort of grew up in the Muslim background in Turkey. And we were walking through India together through Varanasi, and she says, Mike, she says, I know this isn't the devil that's all around me. Everywhere I look, there's devil worship going on. But I was raised in a Muslim culture where I was taught that pretty much everything these Hindus are doing in Varanasi is devil worship. And she's like, so there's this sort of like triggering thing to me. She's like, I can't help it. She's like, I know better. I'm a mystic myself. She's like, and I know better, but it's just like I get triggered from this sort of childhood memories and childhood sort of brainwashing that happened. And so anyways, we get that sort of darkness, that devilishness of Bharani. That whole mystic line is the devil. Anne Frank, she wasn't in a cave, but she was up in an attic, right? She was just like a cave, sort of locked away. Sachin Tendulkar, he's a cricket guy. I don't know anything about him, but I do know, and some of these others too, I think he does worship Ganesha as his main lineage of worship. And so we get that elephant Bharani sort of in Ganesha connection. Get these sort of interesting people like Aung San Suu Kyi, the fourth or fifth name here. She was put in to be the leader of Myanmar, of Burma. I don't know which one's the real name they call it now. So they put her, the West plan to put her in as the leader, and she turned out to be worse than the dictator she was replacing. And so then eventually the military stepped in again and said like, oh, you're worse than the other guys. And so you get again that two sides. She was supposed to be the face of peace and democracy and freedom and all of that, but she turned out to be a worse sort of dictator than the rest of them. That kind of thing. Jean-Paul Sartre, he was also he was part of the war effort, right? So he's like a warrior pope himself in a way, or a warrior philosopher himself as part of the war effort. Eddie Gallagher, Navy SEAL, we see Pope John Paul as a warrior pope. Peter the Great, he was also kind of warrior pope. I really enjoyed reading about Peter the Great. He became almost like a mentor to me in a way, only for the one reason that he would live with the horses. So he he couldn't stand living in the castles or in the palaces or thing like that. He would live out in the stables with the horses, and he would get up really early every day. And he would pour this coffee, really, really strong coffee with mustard seed oil and chili peppers. And that was, he basically lived off kind of cigarettes and coffee, this really hot, spicy coffee. And I thought, oh, you're one of my early gurus, because while I mostly live off coffee and cigarettes myself. So, and I used to live at the stables when my dad was taking care of horses. So I also have those connections. So anyways, quite an interesting for a king. Sometimes he's called the potato king. Brought potatoes in, and that's sort of underground as well, right? Just potatoes. And so root stuff, we really associate the roots with Mula, but you'll find a lot of rootedness and Bharani. Even if we think of that wealth and that money that's getting passed down, it's just rooting people in their lineage, rooting people in their family wealth, in a sense. We get really big gurus with this Vedas, and Bharani seems to be a very nice placement. Again, Hitler, he's a little bit brutal. Thomas Jefferson, we usually think pretty well nice of him. He was fallible though as well. Catherine of Siena, she was a mystic sort of saint. George Strait is interesting, right? He's a country western singer, and so he's like one of these big names and could have had anything he wanted, but he's kind of this, he's still sort of this down home country boy. Takes care of a bunch of land and cattle and things like that. Herds and hordes is a general thing you could say in Bharani as well. But yeah, so he's well, they would never say what his faith is. Apparently he doesn't talk about it. It's very private, sort of, and that sort of underground too, that privacy. But you can tell by his music that he's kind of a nice Christian boy. Charlie Chaplin was just the opposite of that. But we get that very theatrical thing with Charlie Chaplin, the great master of theater. We get more of the Yama and Yami thing going on with him. He had a lot of very, very young girlfriends. If he was alive in our times, it would be criminal. A lot of them were like 13 or 14 years old girls he was impregnating. But there was always a sense, and I think Bharani was, like, so Charlie Chaplin, okay, he was making these very young girls pregnant, but he was taking responsibility for it as well. And so he was taking care of these young girls. He had them a house, he had them a car, took care of their families, made sure they had money. And so it was kind of facing up to those consequences. And that's really like, if you want to be a powerful person in this world, face up to your consequences of your actions. And then it doesn't, in a way, it's like, it doesn't matter what you do. If you face the consequences and suffer that, you can sort of redeem yourself for that. It's 11:03, so it's been a couple hours I've been talking. Some of you have to go, I understand, but I am going to keep talking, and you can see that's going to be a theme of going overtime on these classes, because there's so much. I could go on and on and on and on for days, but I think it's just kind of nice to look at these names together and see how they sort of go together and what they might have anything to do with, you could say. We talked about the mass, this Eduardo Manganto Italian fellow. He did the fencing, with the swords, right? So they also had that sort of mask. And there's something very theatrical about the fencing as well. That kind of thing, the adversary, the pairing off of energy, you could say. Johnny Gottslick, he's one of my relatives actually. He won a Stanley Cup. He was a coach, mostly for women's hockey. But there's a sense too with him. Again, even at the time that he went on to be a coach for women's hockey, there was a lot of sort of teasing he got for that. But it's almost, again, for a man, it's almost that dealing with the devil sort of thing. And he managed to keep actually a really sort of pristine reputation for that. But I'm sure he dealt with a lot of sort of temptation and a lot of that kind of thing in his life. Can we say? Bharani, it's like, We got another great philosopher, Descartes, with his Venus conjunct his moon. But I think this probably was one of his great mistakes in his philosophy, was a sort of sense of, and he gets a lot of criticism for this in some ways as well, is a sort of sense of I think, therefore I am. And it's like, well, he uses the thinking as the proof for the I-ness, where then they come along and say, well, no, actually the sense of I-ness is the proof of the thinking. And so you had the proof of your existence, the ability, that's kind of like tautology, the fact that you want to prove your existence proves your existence, sort of thing. And so that's all he really sort of did. So it was more theatrical. He was also a advisor for some of the great kings. I think there's another advisor here that lost his head to one of the great kings. See, opera, Venus, now we're getting very, very theatrical with Venus, I think. Opera conductors. Someone like Boy George, he might be dated for some of you. He was probably like the first singer. There was all the glam rock going on in the 80s, but he really came out as this really feminine, effeminate singer. I can't remember if he was actually gay or not, or maybe even transgender, but he was really got involved with all of that. There was a very famous movie that shocked everyone, blew everybody's mind on that sort of thing. And he played in that. He was one of the characters. I think he was the transgender character. And there's sort of this scene in that show. I have no idea what the name of the movie was, ancient movie. But there was sort of this scene where they get picked up at the bar and they're in the bedroom together, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, you're a man. And that really, again, some of this stuff predates. Like now we think we're really dealing with those gender issues, but back in the 80s, this stuff started to come out a little bit through the movies that way. And I think Bharani has that sort of like, again, even that transgender movement and some of those feminist movements, it is sort of dealing with the devil. It's like you come in a very nice way, and it's like, oh no, everybody, like, of course, nobody has a problem with transgenders, or nobody has a problem with gays, right? Women's movement and feminism, it's like, okay, yeah, well, yeah, everybody sort of agrees with those basic tenets, but it becomes, in Bharani, these things become this sort of rabbit hole, right? It kind of draws you into this temptation for more power, more friends, and oh, I can make more money, I can make more of those sort of connections in a way. And so again, on the surface, a lot of these movements are they don't look so bad. They're all right. Like, I don't have a problem with feminists, but then you get kind of this extremist sort of tendencies. And maybe that's Bharani's problem, is more the extremist tendencies. Maybe it's not even a problem with the transgender movements or the gay movements or the feminist movements or these kind of movements, you could say. Maybe it's the Bharani sort of people that get involved with them. Bharani likes the extremes, right? It really kind of goes towards those extreme areas. It's like Candace Owens, I have this person, right? She's kind of this right-wing pundit, but she's been working on a lot. She's working on the extreme. She's trying to get those sort of Black audiences that are really extreme Democrats and try to bring them over to her side, right? There's that temptation, like, hey, come over here. And in a lot of ways, she's like, I don't know much about her. I know her from kind of a little bit on YouTube sort of thing, but she's also a very beautiful woman. She's also very much involved with, she's got a lot of money. She's from like kind of an elite family, but there's this temptation. She's trying to bring people over from the Democrat side to the Republican side, like, hey, we got these treats. And as much as I think nowadays you hear about Democrats, sort of this sort of soft cheating to get their voters' votes in, I imagine Candace Owens is on the right wing, sort of doing that same thing, like, hey, the blurring of the legalities there of it to bring the temptation over. Catherine of Siena. Some of these charts you look at, she's a saint, a Christian saint in a sense, but there's some of these older charts. I think there was a sense of some of these, especially when you start to go to the Franciscan side of the Christianity, some of the nunneries, you could say, and the monk places. Anyways, there was some sexual activity going on between them. There was that sort of tantra as well going on in some of these Franciscan lines. And you get that sense from someone like Catherine of Siena's chart. I remember looking at it. I'd pull it up, but you can find her birth time and kind of make it yourselves. Or that, or maybe I'll add it on to this, but there's some of those kind of going down that sort of line of temptation. Rebecca also kind of works a little bit on the boundaries of wellness and sex, you could say. No. Oh wow. Well, cowboys. In a way, like that. So here we got a lot of wealth kind of coming in. Eugene Herigel, he went over to Japan, and he was again one of these early guys to do this, go to Japan and study Zen and study archery. And I think this is quite important with Bharani, because it's that sort of sense of Zen and war, the art of war, that spirituality and that kind of fighting tendency, kind of like sex and death in a sense. And so it's that like life and death sort of themes always coming involved into this. And we see it with a lot of these philosophers, a lot of these people. We talked about Boy George and transgenderism. Zamin is also a transgender. Was a female and became a male. And so I think Bharani also kind of can relate a little bit with these sort of transgender issues. It's ultimately a kind of an underground sort of thing for the most part. And these days, it's kind of funny that it's such a big issue everywhere, because I'm doing little edits as I go. It's funny that it's such a big issue, transgenderism, because I think transgenders account for about 1 or 2% of the population. And here we are talking about it here. And so it's kind of this sort of secret society in a way. And when you think of, well, there's two different things also going on. There's the actual people who are transgenders, and then there's the advocacy groups for the transgenders. And of course, what we deal with mostly, or we hear about from the news, and we hear the news will say, oh, the transgenders are mad about this. And it's like, well, no, the transgender advocacy groups are mad. I don't know. Nobody really knows how the transgender people actually feel. But there's also that theatrical sort of thing about it, and that sort of dance with the devil kind of idea coming out. And I think that's because it's Venus. And so it's coming out quite literally in relationships and these sorts of things. Yeah, we see here Peter Frost, the priest, charged with sexual abuses. Anthony LaVey, Church of Satan. I think he was doing a lot of the same. He was doing these strange, like, sort of sexual death sacrifice rituals. Really kind of creepy dude, Anthony LaVey, in a lot of ways. Jacques Cousteau, that's the explorer Jacques Cousteau. And nobody knows really what he was up to. Probably say the same with Johnny Gottschalk, who's a lot of jokes what's going on in that dressing room, sort of stuff. Here we get some physicians come out more, and there are quite a few physicians have Bharani placement, but Carl Wernicke, he was kind of a physician surgeon. I think he was doing some brain stuff. I was studying a lot of the brain stuff when I was doing Bharani and Ashwini, just to try to understand, like, hey, this is the guy who studied the brain. So what exact thing did he study? And my research or theories is that exact thing that he studied should have something to do with Bharani, because we know Bharani regulates the brain. And so I think he was actually dealing with some language areas in the brain. And we get that with the cryptographers we saw with some of the other placements, and people trying to decipher languages, or people working with second languages. It's that sort of sense of nurture and nature, right? That sense of grammar that is a natural thing in the words that come on top that we get from nature. Well, quite a few architects had this. Andrew Lloyd Webber's an architect. Who else? Anyways, there was quite a few architects had Bharani placements in any case. Just not so much here, just Andrew Lloyd Webber. Albert Speer actually worked in armaments. He was one of these Nazi leaders. He was actually he was an architect too, but he went to work in armaments for the war effort, and very, very good at production. There's some of this, like, he was working with a lot of slave labor and child labor. And so I don't know, that kind of comes up a little bit with Bharani placements as kind of child labor, child exploitation, right? Someone like Epstein has this sort of position. And so, well, a lot of times child exploitation is one of these things that's generally the people who are exploiting children were exploited as children themselves. And so it's again, that sort of lineage, that sort of thing that's getting passed, behaviors getting passed on and passed down. And so you get that sort of thing going on there. Here we get Hitler, Thomas Jefferson, a lot of big crowds, Mark Zuckerberg. Edward M. was a psychoanalyst. Satoshi Nakamoto, I think he was also, maybe he was dealing with string theory, I think. Quite intelligent bunch here as well.
He's the one who created Bitcoin, I'm pretty sure.
Created what?
Bitcoin.
Oh, okay, the Bitcoin inventor. Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay. So that's interesting. And it's really funny. I don't know why I can get his birth time online when they say actually the inventor of Bitcoin is unknown person. And I think Satoshi Nakamoto might be like an alias name or something like that. But there's some underground stuff going on. And if he's the one if he did Bitcoin, then we all know Bitcoin is basically used for criminal transactions and money laundering and things like that. And so it's wonderful, amazing thing. All my Russian friends I know from India, they all have cryptocurrencies. Nobody's dealing in cash. One guy, he was like,
Call it mining also, right? Like the term.
Yeah, it is. It is mining, that sort of crypto mining and Bitcoin mining. And, yeah, you get that kind of mining stuff too in Bharani. So interesting, interesting sort of example there. So you get all that sort of thing going on. Yeah, I still have to join one of those crypto things, so that because I actually know a lot of Russians, and quite literally just about all of them are using cryptocurrencies, and so they have no means of paying me except through cryptocurrencies. The funny thing is they're using a cryptocurrency that's perfectly tied to the American dollar. So it's kind of like, yeah, it's like, yeah, you're a bunch of rebels supporting America. So they're kind of dancing with the devil too.
Like I think Tesla accepts Bitcoin as payments too, kind of thing. So they're playing on both sides as well.
They are. Yeah, and even his reputation is really strong on both sides. It's like people either love him or they hate him, and I think that's a lot of the Bharani placements is really, and it's like I said earlier, it's like what's the difference between extreme love and extreme hate? The passion is the same. The attachment is the same. The amount of power that person has over you is the same. And so there's a lot of those sort of power games coming in to Bharani placements. So even someone like Mother Teresa, you see with Saturn, Bharani, this is Saturn in his debilitation. And it's supposed to be this horrible, awful Saturn. Well, Mother Teresa, her workspace was certainly terrible and awful, right? She was working with the lepers, but she was also an addict. And she was, well, she was very strange, actually, because she was getting a lot of money for medicine for the lepers, but she actually wasn't giving them any medicine. And when it came to the opiums production, she was actually just selling that, and a lot of that to enrich herself, they figure, right? Some of this is rumor and innuendo, but I don't mind tarnishing a great saint, so we'll talk about her sins. And so she was an addict on opium, but she wasn't giving the lepers any painkillers to kill their pain, because her theory is that your pain is purifying your soul so that you can go to heaven. And so you get that sort of extreme, what do they call it? Extreme self-flagellation with Bharani, this sort of idea of that. And so they can really torture themselves quite badly, is really what it ends up being a lot of times with Bharani. But they also don't get a lot of those sort of, their hormones are depressed. And so they don't get a lot of those feelings of attachment or those emotional sort of draws to people. They can be quite cold and quite hard, like Mother Teresa was, just walking around with people who were suffering, and she had a whole storeroom full of opium. Yeah, her own system was full of opium. She did opium when she was dying. She got put right out of it, man. Like, she was having none of that, like, healing holy pain. Yeah, okay, purify my soul for pain. Yeah, okay, give me the morphine. Thank you very much. But there is, and that's a lot of times some sort of drug addiction or some kind of pleasure addiction that does end up crashing the hormone system, you could say. But at the same time, you look at a lot of these people and they're not bad. Edward Norton's quite interesting. I have some placements. When I was looking, I've got a Rachaka Yoga with my Mars in my chart, and there's very, very few people have Rachaka Yoga. And so he's one of them. But he also has a debilitated Saturn. And he's made all kinds of these tough guy prison movies. Again, you might say, yeah, okay, whatever, you're a joke. But actually, that's with Mercury and Bharani. With Saturn and Bharani, he went and lived in the prisons. He went and lived with the prisoners, sort of, to make these movies. Again, kind of becoming that part, but wow, hardcore, man. And you could say that with Saturn and Bharani placements. Like, all these people are going to be like hardcore somehow. Like, they're tough people. Like, just they'll take any kind of pain, and there's also that as well. You might find some of that again on that sexual aspect. Maybe they like pain, those endorphins that get triggered through pain, through fear, right? They might look for that even like in a sexual manner. They might look for those extremes in their life, like they just want to feel something, right? And when sometimes they end up kind of going down these sort of rabbit holes with that, where it has to get more and more and more extreme for them to feel anything. And so it can be quite a dangerous placement in a lot of ways. But we like a lot of these people, right? Mother Teresa is amazing. Pope John the Eighth, well, I don't know if he was a good pope or not, but he's got Pope at the front of his name, so he's all right. James Joyce did all that stream of consciousness stuff nobody can understand. The 10 people that read his book tell us he's great. Edward Norton did that thing like living in jail, becoming very tough. Virginia Woolf was one tough woman as well. And she kind of locked herself. She the one that wrote
Women Who Rode the Wolves.
What's the name of it?
Women who run with the wolves.
Okay, well,
Not
oh,
her?
no, that's not Virginia Woolf.
Oh.
Room of Her Own?
A Room of My Own,
Yeah.
yeah, or something like the title in English. Yeah, the other one
Yeah.
is Clarissa Piccola Estes.
Oh, yeah.
So
That's
there's
because
there's that tendency we see with depressed people to kind of lock themselves in the room. A room of my own, right? That's what she did. She locked herself up to write. Deva Permal has this. She was also, I don't know if she still tours. She does a lot of like the devotional music and stuff. Brought a lot of those like famous mantras and sang them out in this gorgeous, amazing voice. I don't know what she's sort of become, but I would imagine she suffered some depression in her life. Again, I think it's from this, like, she's just had so much pleasure and so much partying and so many nice things and just too much. And now it's sort of, it crashes the system afterwards.
I have that placement and that's exactly how I go out and about in the world. It's like I go very hardcore, like I'll go to, you know, pools and places like that, whatever, and then I'll retreat and I won't like see anyone. I'll go in my cave and then I'll go out again and do a lot of things and I'll retreat again.
Yeah, is your Saturn in Bharani? Yeah,
Yeah.
but you have Jupiter kind of reversing
Ashwini.
the rotation or something. Yeah,
I have Jupiter and Ashwini, yeah, in the 9th house.
yeah, so, you got an old hell dog like me, I guess, for a teacher. Um, um, so that kind of thing. We can see it's like Jackson Pollock as well, like hardcore, crazy, make these paintings, then he kind of crash. So many serious addictive tendencies he had. Some of these people I don't really know, like Ella Bell, that's Travolta's daughter, Naomi Campbell, a model, I think, but I don't know if she went addiction past. Bobby Hatfield, I think he's a drummer. A lot of the drummers, of course, are heavy metal drummers and things like that. Karsten Berg is kind of interesting. He dealt with a lot of so I shouldn't put his name out there, but nobody knows him. Carson B. He dealt with a lot of the sort of modern sex tantra, but then he also got into doing kind of videoing and directing some pornography as well. There was actually an ashram, not an ashram. God, I've heard crazy things in my days. So there was a yoga studio in the city, one city I know some people in, and this yoga studio, it's been around for quite a while. But what they were doing is they were actually, it was almost a precursor to OnlyFans, is they're running kind of a pornography ring out the back of this yoga studio. And so several of the yoga teachers themselves were involved in it, but they were also involved in sort of recruiting other beautiful yogi girls. And so anyways, this fellow was he was kind of dealing with that. It was kind of an elite and high-end yoga studio as well. It's kind of, it blew my mind when I found out about it. But again, that sort of underground sort of cult thing going on in the background. So yeah, anyway, some of these yoga, and someone was like, Mike, this isn't uncommon for yoga studios. And I was like, what? And so apparently it's not uncommon for yoga studios to be doing like kind of a pornography thing on the side. So, and that's very Bharani, of course it is. How can it not be? Kind of this, it's like you might belong to the yoga studio, but it's like there's a back door. There's a secret cult underground, under something going on beneath the basement of these places. And so all very Bharani sort of stuff. Baghdad has Saturn and Bharani placements. And so it's also gone between being either a very spiritual city or being a very destroyed place. And that's kind of those two phases, right? It's going and celebrating and getting very spiritual and connecting to God, or destroying themselves in a lot of ways. John Archibald Wheeler. Again, some of these scientists, Werner Braun, quite a few scientists here. Robert Bouet was a scientist. Lance Armstrong was kind of a bouncer. He's kind of more the bulldog figure. He's a doorkeeper himself, football player, bouncer, really mean dude. Famous for being mean in football. And Tony Gaudi, I think he was if I've got that correct, he was doing some expressionism. He was doing kind of these masked, kind of clown type expressionist stuff, but very political, similar to some of the other artists with this, where he was making a lot of fun of the kind of ruling elite, and he wasn't liked at all.
He was an architect, more the buildings of Barcelona, Antoni Gaudí.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. I'm trying to think who the guy was making clown faces then. But then we get more of the architects here.
Yeah, but very weird architecture, like curvature and in colors. I'm sure you've seen it. It's like very famous. He broke like all the laws of architecture, and it's very expressionist in the colorful ways.
And I think some of his he was the guy, like some of it was almost like going into a cave. It was really like a lot of depth and a lot of space going into his architecture. Yeah, okay, that was that fellow then. Okay. Yeah. Well, sometimes I've just researched so many people, I get my names confused. So I'm glad you guys, I can see you guys kind of looking up these names when I go, oh, and this guy did that, and that guy did that. So that's wonderful. So we'll just look quickly at Rahu and Ketu sort of things. Here we got Franco right off the bat, brutal dictator. Get some goalkeepers. Going to space. Wow, it's a very mixed sort of people here. Wheeler again, a scientist, I think string theory or nuclear physics sort of thing. Oh, here we go. And my mama is Donna H. She's forensic psych nurse, kind of dealing criminal justice sort of system. Tattoo Baba. He was a student of mine. He does tattoo, but he's like a skateboarder, hardcore underground dude, actually. But doing also astrology, probably also dealing with a lot of criminals. You won't find him online. I'm a nickname I made up for him. You get a few of these people, do yogis and teaching yoga. Might be a little bit of OnlyFans sort of stuff going on with some of these people as well. Buster Keaton was actually just very similar to what was the other guy doing silent films? Charlie Chaplin. Very similar characters, both doing those silent films, doing a lot of almost stuntman stuff. Buster Keaton, like really, he's one of the early stuntmen doing really wild stuff. He's great to see if you see his stuff on YouTube. But kind of taking his life into his hands in a sense. There was someone else, I just saw their name. Anyways, there's some other kind of stuntmen sort of people. Oh, Buster Keaton and then Tins Ken. That's another nickname. You won't find Tins Ken on there. But Tins Ken is like an acrobat, like almost like a circus acrobat, and kind of traveling, doing this kind of stuff. In a way, Buster Keaton was a little bit the same as that. I think Tattoo Bubba also does a lot of festivals and things like that. My mother doesn't do any of this stuff, but she's still like, she'll do yoga with me once in a while, and she's in her 70s, and she can still like bust a move in yoga, man. My mom is amazing, superwoman. But she was also actually, this is also very Bharani. She was dealing with she was like a forensic psych nurse, but she was dealing mostly with people with sex abuse crimes and schizophrenics in a way. And so really kind of going down that sort of rabbit hole. And she would be considered like, if you heard my mom's views of sex abusers, she doesn't make very many friends by contemporary views. You could say very controversial in her views of that. But you see some with sexual abuse. There's a Astro data bank. If you just type in sexual abuse, it'll bring up these kind of anonymous names with AA ratings with their thing. And so I've got some of these people. I don't know much about them. I do know most of the ones I have. It was someone who basically went into a what do you call it, a cat house, a whorehouse, and kind of did astrology for all the whores in the place, and starting to heard their stories and things like that. And so most of the people who go and work in a whorehouse kind of grew up with some sexual abuse as well. And so you've got this kind of crossing of sexual abuse, sex work, all these sort of blending together. Someone like Gordon Ramsay, I'm not sure, I know he was a chef, but he's the guy, was he the Iron Chef, or was he the guy that had a Hell's Kitchen? I think he was the Hell's Kitchen guy. And so again, you're getting that hell, you're getting the devil kind of coming out in these Bharani placements in these strange sort of ways. Hell's Kitchen, Robert Bustani, he's more of a what do you call it, physics. But he studied physics, but almost kind of engineering, and then he brought that into the body and the physics of the body. And he's probably one of these sort of great sort of yoga therapists that are out there now. But he's an old man, he's in his 70s. He's still sleeping with 25-year-old students. He's still sleeping with like these young students, and big like dramas in his life from sleeping with these young girls, and not really wanting much to do with them afterwards, of course, or not of course, but whatever in his case. And so, oh my God, he's got so much sexual drama, and he's like in his 70s, but he's full power. He's very healthy for his 70s. Again, I haven't done his chart for him, but I've done some of his student charts, and so that's why I kind of know these sort of things. I know everybody's secrets. I've done all the gurus' charts. I know and all the gurus, like all their close students. I've done all their close students' astrology chart. I know like oh my God, it's what you expect. But so you get this sort of thing. What else can you say? Who else can you say? Eckhart Tolle is here. The Power of Now, very Aries sort of stuff. I think he's got some Ashwini placements that really highlight that sort of power of now. But he's kind of interesting too, because he's held up as being the spiritual guru, but he's just kind of this very secular, good public speaker. People trust him. They like his accent, sort of thing. Great book too, but also kind of a one-hit wonder that way. Who else do we got? Oh, we got Genevieve. She's wonderful. She's a beautiful spiritual heart, and very good knowledge on all the spiritual stuff. But she like traps animals and kills animals and hunts, and she's like, she could probably kill people. She's trained to use her hands like yeah, she's God, she's just everything. So she's quite an amazing person. Yeah, so you got a bit of this. Anderson Marcos, he's one of the he's kind of a gatekeeper for the ayahuasca and things like that around here. And so again, that gatekeeper thing, but selling drugs and kind of different sort of spiritual lineage path. I'm gonna get to here. You'll see a lot of politicians have these Bharani placements because, especially in modern times, you don't get to become a politician unless you dance with the devil, right? You've made a deal somewhere and you have to make these deals. It's kind of like it's such a dirty business. You know, you get these very, someone will put forth a very, oh, of course, everybody should know that and everybody should do that, but people will actually vote against it. And it's not so much that they vote against the idea, it's that they're in someone's court or they owe someone else a favor. And so they have to vote against that because of those favors. And so politics and bills that are getting passed through in politics aren't getting passed through like not in a democratic way at all. It's all very autocratic. And they're getting past the guy who has enough people that owe him favors can get a bill passed. And so again, it's that sort of dancing with the devil idea that comes into Bharani placements. Yeah, Sadhguru with Bharani placement. He's got like a very strong inner circle Sadhguru has. And there's almost like he's got a few circles within circles till you get to this really, really very private sort of inner circle that he's got going on there. And there's a lot of dirty business going on there. I've done charts for. It's funny, he doesn't believe in astrology. He kind of makes fun of astrologers and his things, but all his closest students really strongly believe in astrology. Believe me, because I've done charts for most of them. So it's kind of funny. And then I kind of like, anyways, I give them a really hard time because they keep coming to me with their problems, and I keep going, well, you've got a big guru like Sadhguru. Take your problems to Sadhguru and bring your money to me. Instead, you bring your money to Sadhguru and you bring your problems to me. Anyways, I like to give them a hard time that way. And so you get this sort of underground cults, underground sort of thing kind of happening that way. You get some prison thing, Derek Chauvin. That's the cop that killed the beginning of the whole. John, none of this is, I think I've talked for enough. We're almost done now. The whole, what was all the big race riots in America? Anyways, it was Derek Chauvin that killed the black dude that started all of that. Derek Chauvin was the cop. And so anyways, he went to jail for all of that. Again, very controversial figure. Of course, a lot of people think he shouldn't have went to jail. Botanists, explorers, kind of crossing bridges, crossing lines, crossing to the other side. Sangita Narmada, she's another one doing the teaching. That's not her real name. You won't find her either, but she's also teaching the sexy tantra. Very aggressive way. Alexis A also teaching sort of sexy tantra. I don't know if that's as aggressive as Sangita. So you get a bit of that sort of stuff kind of going on. Charles Bukowski, right? He's kind of considered a guru figure, but he's as much of a devil as he is a guru figure. And so you see a lot of that kind of stuff going on. Yeah, well, no. So I am going to leave it at that because my brain stopped working now. It gave up. It just threw in the towel. Said enough is enough. So I appreciate you guys hanging out here for gosh, almost 3 hours, listening to me just talk away and babble away here. But we got through a lot of it. Yeah. And Bharani's such an interesting. I really enjoy Bharani. It's somehow some of these things, like some of these nakshatras, I just didn't like them. When I'm doing the research, I was just like, oh, I have to look at that again. I have to look at those people again. I don't like any of these people. Like, who are you people? Go away from me. But other ones that really resonate with me, and Bharani is one of the ones that really sort of resonates nicely. So blah blah blah. I went for 3 hours. So Mahadev, and I thank you for coming.
You.
And I'll see you next week.